There are territories in the north of the empire that were notorious for their impassability, as well as the danger that reigned there. These lands were owned by the Boreati family. At the moment, they are ruled by a duke named Felio Boreoti. From his rather young age, he could boast two unique traits. And here is the first of these traits really adorned him, but the second ugly. In his own family, the duke was nicknamed the Black Beast. And all this because of the fact that he has such ferocity that he could kill with just his own gaze. In any case, he had hair the color of a raven wing, as well as piercing black eyes. His eyes shone from afar, and he also had a sharp nose and chin line. He also had moderately plump lips of a pale shade, a developed body, and a strong neck. But even so, he also had a mountain of other pluses. He was one of the two dukes who left aristocrats sleepless, literally the most enviable groom in your empire. The man was now at his estate, and noticed that the work in the capital was finished, so preparations should be made to return to the north. The subordinate immediately remarked that he would prepare everything in the best way possible. But suddenly the man turned to him again and declared that he would adopt the child. The subordinate was very surprised to hear these words from His Majesty, so turned to him and asked him what he must be joking about now. The man looked at him coldly, and then inquired but what he must be joking about. The interlocutor remarked that it was indeed so. That was what started the misunderstanding. After a while, the Duke went to the orphanage, which was located in the east. He sat waiting for the child that was to be brought to him and shown to him. A girl was carried to him, who was already contentedly wary. And so when she was brought in, she immediately turned her attention to the man who sat in the chair. The man had a rather gloomy look, and therefore looked at her rather strangely that moment. Because of this, he seemed quite scary to the young girl, and she immediately began to cry. At that, she didn't even say a word, and continued crying for a very long time. The Duke immediately covered his face in order for the girl to calm down a bit. At the same time, she was taken out of the room so that she would not be afraid and scream. And now, at last, the Duke could lower his hand. Next, he turned to his subordinate and asked how long he should be patient. The interlocutor remarked, but hadn't he himself ordered to find a child for him? At the same time, he stated that this was, after all, even new records. His Majesty asked what record he was talking about, and it turns out it was already the 5th orphanage. The subordinate asked if not all the children immediately start sobbing at the first sight of him. Even he doesn't dare to look him in the eye, so it wasn't bad. Felio noticed that if he thought hard enough, it had been a long time since his sword had turned bloody. The interlocutor realized that he shouldn't stipulate such a thing, so he remarked that it was pure disrespect, and it all comes from children being so ignorant. But in his mind, he thought why his destiny had given him such a task. Immediately, he looked at His Majesty carefully and wondered why he needed a child so suddenly. The man, for his part, sat really quite pensive and pondered over the situation that had happened earlier. His interlocutor then came to him out of the joy on his face, noticing that his son had spoken yesterday. "You days will see your own child babbling daddy, daddy, such happiness." Though the man cared for his little brother and worked hard for it. But this is something else. Felio stated that if he talked a lot, vocal nodules would form. The man then inquired if he seriously doesn't realize that. Next, the man inquired when Herzog was going to get married. The man remarked that he would marry when the man dies. He wants the man to be his Seidon. The interlocutor refused this and remarked that even if his child was as cowardly as a rabbit, it was not like he could bring him back. Felio stated to look at his stupid face and then repeated it. The guy in turn looked at his own child and remarked that being a father is really a truly noble thing. It is in fact a beautiful thing, and he hoped the day would come when his interlocutor would feel it too. After these reminiscences, Herzog turned to his subordinate again. He asked if he understood correctly that they had already met all the children of the orphanage. The interlocutor remarked that it was so counting this child he had met 18 children. His Majesty remarked that if that is so, they are heading to the next orphanage. The subordinate remarked that he understood. Next, he watched the Duke leave sadly, exhaling because of it. At that, he thought lastly that it was better for him not to get married after all, even though he is indeed an enviable groom. After a while, they had already left the orphanage and were on their way to the carriage. There he was stopped by the owner of this orphanage, who addressed the Duke. The man turned his attention to him, and the man apologized to him with a smile on his face. Apologized to you for not being able to help him properly. Noticing that all the children he was shown were really beautiful as well as kind. And to all this, to see the Duke live is really a great fortune. If a word is to be said, winter is coming soon, and he worries if her guts can live comfortably in such dank times. The subordinates were well aware that this man was clearly asking for the Duke's support. But they were inside. If one looked at the condition in the room they were in, it seems like these people are absolutely not going to do anything about it. If one still thought like this, the next orphanage would be no exception. Suddenly, all this talking and thinking was interrupted by a children's scream that came from outside. All the people who were there immediately turned their attention to it. There was a rather dirty little girl being held by a man. She kept trying to break free from the man and screaming for him to let her go now. Just a few moments later, she clamped her teeth into his hand and broke free. Immediately after that, she started running away. And when she had run away a little, she stopped right in front of the Duke. He, in his turn, also paid attention to her and looked at her, as always, with his cold gaze. But the girl at that, too, made eye contact with him. She called this man uncle and continued to look very angrily right into his eyes. His Majesty Herzog also looked her in the eyes, and just like that, they stood like that for a few minutes. When the subordinate saw himself this situation, it was just dumbfounded. He saw that this little girl didn't even cry when she saw the terrifying Duke. In addition, if you look closely at her well, she has the same black color of her hair and eyes. They are literally the same rich dark color as his lordship's. The master of the orphanage saw what had happened and was immediately wary. He apologized to his lordship and shouted for his subordinates to hurry up and get rid of that annoying child. But the Duke raised his hand, covering his mouth. At the same instant, he turned to Roop. The boy stated to him that this child was indeed not on the list. The master of the orphanage became wary again and noticed that simply this child had absolutely no manners at all. Also, to top it all off, she is constantly making some sort of scandal. His Majesty's subordinates in turn asked if this meant that they dared to ignore his lordship's order. After all, he had mentioned the Duke's desire to see literally all the children in this orphanage before his visit here. All the people from the orphanage immediately fell to their knees and started apologizing and begging for His Majesty's forgiveness. Take did not realize that he was now facing imminent reprisal if they did not do so. The young girl, for her part, looked at him in surprise. The Duke then turned to her and asked her what her name was. The girl, in turn, shouted that she didn't have one. He remarked that even if she was an orphanage girl, she should have a name. When the little girl stated that they call her Nia, but she hates that name. The man stated that she was indeed fearless and asked if she was aware of whose path she dared to block now. Next, he continued to give her a rather angry look and remarked that it was fine if she suddenly got out of breath now. But as they moved even closer to the young babe, she remained in the same place and continued to stare angrily into his eyes. Next, the Duke called the people of the orphanage creatures. And after that, she noticed that, of course, the given name did not suit her at all. And right after he said that, he hesitated. For a while, he looked at the girl and then to the side. And then he noticed that there was a name called Leonie. So he called the girl Leonie Boreati. When she heard that name, she was a bit even excited. The man looked directly at her and said that this would be her name from now on. Girl, she thought for a few seconds, and then noticed that it was too long. The interlocutor noticed that she was a fool, and now live her Leonie. The girl became angry and yelled that she was not a fool. The man walked closer to her and then picked her up in his arms. While doing so, he remarked that when they returned to the estate, a tutor should be called for her. The heroine was shocked because of what she heard just that. Also, His Majesty's subordinate was also shocked at the situation that was going on. The man started dragging the girl to the carriage, and the man asked him in surprise what he was doing. The Duke, in turn, took the girl to his carriage and sat her down there. Next, he stroked her head, and the girl called the old man and cried out if he was serious. She asked if he really enjoyed abusing a small child like that. The man remarked that it was even a lot more fun than he had previously thought. The girl then declared that this old man was indeed some kind of pervert. The subordinate tried to address His Majesty, but he simply slammed the carriage door behind him and answered nothing. The guy stayed in the same spot and was dumbfounded. Now the heroine was really Leonie Boreati, Ferzo Leonie's roaring lion. Count Canis Line was one of the few people who were genuinely friends and socialized with Duke Boreati. They were two men who had troubled the hearts of girls as far back as the academy itself. The Duke himself appeared as if he were some kind of harsh, snowy mountain, and the Count was always like a warm summer field. And so when the Count had time, he devoted all that time to his child. He also said that being a father was really worth it. Perhaps all of this was really capitalizing on the Duke's thoughts. The girl remarked to him to already sit up straight. He, in turn, shouted for her to be quiet. Next, he went on to say that very day, he saw a lot of families that were outside, so it comes out that they all really looked happy in his eyes, and it was a lot of fun. The heroine, with surprise afterward, inquired not if that was why he had decided to adopt her. The interlocutor coldly replied that it was indeed so. The girl was adorned by this and remarked that it was not usually like this at all. When there was no child for a long time, she was very fond of children, or when she came to the service and saw dying babies. But to have a child on the advice of a friend is somehow too much. His Majesty inquired, "But does she always whine so much?" The girl was upset and told the old man that he must be out of his head. The man remarked that she was the only person who talked to him like that and was still alive today. But isn't that what she wanted before, and ran out to him for it? The little girl looked at him and agreed to it all the same, but it wasn't particularly willing. That being said, she figured she had managed to escape from that very damned orphanage anyway. It all felt to her like a gamble. In doing so, she had never even considered that fortune might turn to her. Now he was thinking back to the whole situation that had come before, and all those conversations with people. Remembering the whole situation, the girl turned to the old man and remarked that she had one request for him. She went on to say that the director, as well as all the other caretakers, had embezzled all the money that belonged to the orphanage. His Majesty Casino at her, and then remarked that this did indeed seem to be true. The little girl, for her part, continued to say that they had all abused their powers. It got to the point where they even keep in touch with the pimp. The man was dumbfounded by what he had just heard from her, so he inquired if the girl really knew what a pimp was. She shouted that all she knows is this man who sells people in the hotel. The man looked at her sadly, and the girl noticed that these people turned in her older little sister to the pimp. The heroine asked if he could punish them for that. The interlocutor asked if everyone was. Babe remarked that as far as Connie's teacher was concerned, she hadn't done anything wrong. She did care about them. His Majesty stated that Arta must be the woman with the brown hair and also the broken finger. The girl stated that this was so, but did not understand how he could know this. The interlocutor bet that if you think back on the whole situation, she was the only one who cared about the girl. The heroine noticed that when this man was drinking, he was always hitting all of them. The Duke asked if this was the headmaster we were talking about, and inquired if this man had put a bruise on her arm. The little girl looked at her arm and noticed that it wasn't. It was another kindergartner. But here are the wounds that are on her back. They are wounds from the principal's blows. That is why she is asking for the man to punish all of them. The interlocutor asked how he should punish them. Does he have to kill them all? The protagonist stated that it was not so. Let him torture them until they start begging for their own death. His Majesty immediately turned his back on her and wondered if she was really only 5 years old. Next, the Duke opened a window and a subordinate immediately addressed him. His Majesty handed Roop some papers and remarked for him to stay here. The interlocutor was shocked at what the man was about to do. The man, in turn, kept saying that the place was quite dirty, so it wouldn't hurt him to clean it up. Let him not leave any dust after all and clean the place clean. The subordinate stated that he understood. Then the main menu and did not address him and called him uncle. He remarked when he picks on him, let him use a leather belt and let him take good care of his arms and back. Also, let him take and stick their heads in a bucket of water and then give the floors a good scrubbing. All this he shall do to make those people forget even to think of their nasty deeds. To all this, let him do it to everyone except Teacher Coney, for she was kind to them. And the evidence of all their foul misdeeds lay in the safe behind the frame. Rupa was horrified by all these words, for he didn't expect such a thing from a little girl. His Majesty the Duke, in turn, also noticed that she was indeed an unusual girl. And so, after these words, the carriage set off with them. Near the orphanage, only His Majesty's subordinates remained, as well as a few guys still. One of them remarked whether it could be that she was the secret child of the Lord as well. Rup stated that they should do their job first after all. The carriage, along with His Majesty as well as the title character, continued on their way. It was already quite late in the yard at this time. It was time. The girl sat in the passenger seat and was covered with a blanket, for it was already quite cold. His Majesty continued to sit in his own seat too, and watched the girl carefully. He could perfectly see all the bruises she had, as well as the not particularly proper appearance she had. Suddenly, the carriage stopped. His lordship immediately turned his attention to the window and saw that yes, someone was knocking. His subordinate was there, so he turned to her and inquired what had happened. The first thing Madame Lebeev did was to apologize to him for the sudden stop. She remarked that it was quite late in the day, and so she assumed the girl was tired from the long ride. The man turned to the girl and asked her what she thought about them spending the night at this inn. The little girl immediately stated that she was fine. The interlocutor did not listen to her and said that everything was decided. Then the heroine was wary and asked if he listened in common ever. His Majesty noticed that because she did not eat, her voice even became squeaky. Next, they did pull up to an inn that was on the road. The man thought that here the girl would at least rest in peace. After that, they began to get out of the carriage, and he looked at her carefully. The little girl, cautiously, looking all around, also slowly got out. His Majesty turned to Madame Lebivas. The Duke remarked that when Léonie had gained strength, let them prepare to set out. The subaltern remarked that she would do everything. As they were talking, their dialogue was interrupted by the protagonist. While the girl was trying to climb off the carriage, she couldn't hold on and started falling down. The man noticed this situation and immediately jumped to the girl in order to save her. With a sharp movement, he went in her direction and, crouching on one knee, still managed to catch her. The girl, in turn, rejoiced because of the situation that had happened, but noticed that she almost died. Also at that, she asked the old man not to grab her like that in the cutoff. His lordship's subordinate saw this situation and thought that the master had kneeled down. This is some kind of horror. Suddenly, the man turned to her and remarked to her to take care of this little child. She was alert at the remark that she would do anything. His Majesty stated that she should still warm herself before eating. And so, when his lordship, the Duke, handed the little heroine to the girl, she remarked that she would tell her master to get it all ready. When the little girl was in the duo's arms, inquired who the little sister was. The interlocutor remarked that her name was Labavelle Melis, but let the girl still call her just Melis. The heroine asked her if the little sister is also a knight. She noticed that the little girl did get it right. The little girl got excited because of that, and noticed that it was really very cool. The knight looked at her and thought that she was really very cute. After a while, after all, he did not go inside the building. And so, when the little girl was in the bathroom, the knight's facial expression changed a lot. She sharpened her attention at her back, where there were visible abrasions, and therefore was simply horrified. The heroine tried to reach her for a while, but she did not answer, and answered only after a while. The little girl asked if her back looked so bad after all. The interlocutor was surprised, and the girl sadly continued to say, sooner her scars would still be pinched. She further asked if the girl had ever fallen asleep because of the pain in her back, and the fact that the wounds had reopened there. The interlocutor asked that the mistress close her eyes, and the girl agreed to this. After that, she began to wash her body and told mistress not to worry about the injuries. After all, if she really ate well and also rested well, all those wounds would heal quickly. Her younger brother had brought a healing ointment with him, so she will take it and then apply it to the place where the main character has abrasions after bathing. The girl immediately smiled. She heard that. At the same time asked if the little sister has a brother. The interlocutor noted that this is so. He is a little clumsy, so he is always injured. After a while, the little girl had already shown herself to His Majesty. She was bathed and also perfectly dressed. The man did not say anything to her, and the girl continued to rejoice. She was saying what a beautiful fragrance was coming from her. She had never been so fragrant in her life. Next, His Majesty remarked, "How much insurance, do not bathe anything, still will not change." The heroine was shocked at the way he called her, and so she shouted, "Is there any complaint about her appearance?" The interlocutor remarked that she was ridiculous. He had absolutely no complaints at all, but now that she was his daughter, and this added to the plant for him. The heroine, for her part, kept yelling for him to now put up with her for the rest of his life. She also called him an old man, and stated that it was now this grandpa's fate. The man stated that after all, no one has ever talked like this in their life. The little girl continued to say that this is what is called, as it is called, upbringing. After that, they continued to look at each other in silence for a while. Meles also looked at them and realized that they were suitable for each other. Sometime after dinner, the heroine fell asleep. His Majesty, for his part, continued to sit in his chair. Also next to him was a knight. She noticed that the girl's injuries were much more serious than they had previously realized. From what the mistress said, the torture had gone on for quite a long time after all. She's very small and puny for her age, and the children in the orphanage must not have been properly fed back then. His Majesty thought for a while because of these words. After that, he looked at Madame and turned to her. Her interlocutor turned to him and waited to see what he would say to her. The Duke remarked to them to send a message to the orphanage. "It works out for me that those people who have ever raised a hand against the children have them delivered to his estate." Next, he made a rather serious look and remarked that he would personally punish them. In the morning, the protagonist continued to admire her own appearance. She looked at her clothes and remarked that this was the first time she had seen such beautiful clothes. Next to her was Melis, who remarked that indeed she looked wonderful. His Majesty stated that now at least she was starting to look like a human being. The heroine got very angry again and noticed that she was a human. The one as her new father still had to give and ride some kind of compliment. The man in turn noticed, but why should he praise someone who does not shine with beauty? The girl ran up to him and wondered if the old man was overdoing it. Even though he probably forgot, he is now her father. His Majesty stated that she still continues to call him old man even so. And the heroine remarked that she's just not used to calling someone daddy. The interlocutor noticed that he, in turn, is simply not used to throwing compliments around. Then they fell silent for a while. And then, the man said that if she wants so much to hear the praise in her address, then let her gain weight first. The knight at this time declared to His Majesty that she would go as far as to check the carriage. When the girl walked out the door, the other knights were already waiting for her there. They greeted Melis, and we in turn asked if it was all about departure. The interlocutors remarked that she had gotten it right and everything was ready. Further, they noticed some worried look of the girl, and so they inquired what was wrong. They wondered if something was wrong. The knight noticed that everything was fine. It was just that the Duke was acting rather strangely towards the young mistress. The interlocutors noticed that he did not understand why she was so disturbed by it. It was simply not clear to him what she means, saying that the gentleman behaves in some unusual way. Suddenly, His Majesty the Duke came out of the room. He had a little girl in his arms and inquired why they were standing in front of the entrance. The subordinates immediately apologized to his lordship for this. Next, they remarked to my lord what an all-around beautiful morning it was now. Melis remarked to His Majesty that some of the dishes would take some time to prepare. The man, in turn, stated that then it would be possible to take a little walk. The heroine at his shoulder waved to the knights who stood behind what. They too waved back at him, but when they all found they didn't realize what it was. After a while, the protagonist was already completely fed up. Also, their carriage had already set off on the road to the estate where the Duke lived. On the way, the girl wondered what would happen if she suddenly became ill. His Majesty remarked, and what would happen, the main thing is that she should not be impatient. The girl remarked that the carriage was very expensive, and it would be too much of a shame if it got spoiled. Also, all the cleaners who will clean it, coming from her father, is not easy. The man wondered with surprise why she was worrying about it now. After all, she is a member of the Boryoshia family now, so it appears that such a one is like some kind of dust to them. During the time she is worrying here, they have earned enough money to buy another carriage like this, so she can even now ask him for anything. The heroine excitedly let out a cheerful exclamation. He looked at her with surprise, and the girl joyfully went on to say that the old man is indeed very cool. And to all this, it is true to say that money is the best thing that can happen to a person. Because of this, the Duke was even more shocked. Next, the girl noticed that she was actually feeling good about herself and didn't want to throw up because it was so unpleasant. It is said that to be happy, you need to have not only money, but also a rich inner world. The man scratched the back of his head and remarked that they must be bullshitting. And the girl touched the window and declared that she thought so too. These, they said, are poor people who convince themselves that by doing good deeds, they can get closer to God. She went on to say that the starter was still quite pleasant to deal with. The interlocutor answered nothing to this, saying that he could not hear the girl. Now he thought that he needed things, food supplies, and a lot of things to buy. At the same time, he remembered in his heart the words that it is the poor who convince themselves by means of good deeds. He liked those words quite a bit, and thought the girl was quite clever. The heroine, for her part, looked out of the window, and there she saw Meles smiling at her. Next, the knight turned away to command something to his subordinate, and the heroine turned to His Majesty and declared that she really liked this girl. My lord, in turn, remarked that the girl she was referring to was a rather excellent knight. He now turned his attention to his new daughter, and when he thought about it for a bit, he realized that Leonie needed a knight to guard her. He realized that of the people the child needed, it was an etiquette teacher, also an escort, and a maid. Now he was just thinking about it, and realized that the perfect candidate for a guard for the girl would be the knight Meles. After a moment, he turned to the heroine and asked if she had ever used a similar gate. But a short time later, the girl was already outside and spewing rainbows. A knight sat beside her and wondered to her mistress if she was all right. His Majesty the Duke was also there and noticed that the girl was indeed weak. Until this moment, when the man turned to the girl, she had wondered what kind of gate the girl was talking about. After all, she did not understand what it could even be. The man stated that, to put it simply, it was something that could instantly transport her to a great distance. When a person is traveling for the first time, it can get really bad, but those are isolated cases. And this same gate literally looks like some kind of tunnel. The girl then replied that she had never been there, but she thought she would be fine. And now she was sitting in the knight's arms, and she didn't feel good. The girl was literally saying she was dying. And Increase, who noticed that he had never seen anyone die from motion sickness before. The little girl remarked that her old man was indeed a heartless statue. The man stated that she was already feeling better since she was being so squeamish. Immediately afterward, he removed his outer garment and enveloped the girl in it. He then took her in his arms and began to lull her in his arms. At the same time, he patted her on her back, trying to calm her down and make her fall asleep there. At the same time, the girl noticed that he should not pat her on the back because she felt like she was going to vomit again. The interlocutor remarked that she must be talking too much, and the girl asked if he was okay with her throwing up on his clothes. The Vix remarked that he hoped she was just joking now. For a while, he still continued to lull her to sleep. It wasn't long before the girl did fall asleep. He watched her carefully, but he also noticed that she still looked like a goblin. The Order of the Knights of Glasdigo is the defense as well as the backbone of the North. They have all served the Duchy of Berethia for many years. They are the loyal dogs of the man nicknamed the Black Beast. However, it was not like that right now. He was standing in his arms with his young daughter and trying to lull her to sleep while doing so. This scene is definitely a beautiful scene, but for the knights, it looks really frightening. Melissa remarked for everyone else to get ready to go as soon as mistress recovered a little bit. The subordinates immediately divulged, and so, after a while, they set off. They made their way through various places, including mountain tunnels, as well as snowy roads. But the carriage did not stop and rushed to its destination. The girl sat in His Majesty's arms and looked out of the window. There she saw the rather beautiful city into which they had entered. It was monumental and majestic. Also, the streets of this city were quite lively and crowded with people. At the same time, the protagonist rushed to the window and was quite excited. She noticed that this was the first time she had ever seen such beauty in front of her. His Majesty remarked that all this beauty was a trifle compared to the capital, but the girl noted how else she would know that, since she had never been to the capital before. That being said, she thought that this place did seem quite beautiful to her as well. Next, she noticed that there was a lot of snow. The man remarked that the lands of Boreotia have snow until spring. The heroine wondered if it was always cold here. The interlocutor remarked that everything is normal. She will literally soon get used to it. After a while, His Majesty's carriage was already approaching the manor. Inside, there was a tense atmosphere, and it was said that they should hurry up because the Duke had returned, so they should get ready. And so the maid went outside and noticed that the carriage was already entering their estate, so she immediately went downstairs to greet His Majesty. As she approached the carriage, the door swung open. The woman immediately bowed and greeted His Majesty, congratulating him on his return. But suddenly, she turned her attention forward, and there she saw the main character. It was very unexpected for her. The girl, in her turn, scrutinized the whole place and shouted that her house was so huge, but her excited cries were interrupted by the Duke himself. He picked up the girl in his arms, and so held her. All the subordinates, as well as the maids, lined the corridor and saluted their master. They bowed before him and wished a good homecoming for his lordship. The girl, for her part, tried to break free from him, for she was very uncomfortable with him holding her like that. But just a moment later, she stopped, for her man pointed her out with his hand. Then she looked at him carefully and noticed that she was already feeling well. The man remarked that he knew it himself. After a while, the girl turned to him, calling him an old man. The man asked what she wanted, and the heroine stated that she was hungry. The man remarked that she should wait a little bit, and then she would already be fed. The maids, as well as the attendants, were shocked at the way she called him. Next, the protagonist turned to him again and noticed that his chest, definitely she liked. As she did so, she touched it with her hand. The man looked at her with surprise then, and was shocked at what she was telling him. Sometime after that, His Majesty Duke Yor inside in his arms with the girl. The attendants continued to bow to him as they greeted him. The protagonist stepped inside. This immediately drew her attention to the majestic building that was inside beautifully. Because of this, she got rather strong, enthusiastic, and noticed that she had the feeling that this house was an illustration of a dark story, literally some story that sounds like a criminal among us. The maid who was nearby was shocked, but what was going on? His Majesty wondered how she could know after all. The girl remarked, "Is it really true? Isn't he a murderer and has killed someone here?" The man noticed that there was a prison here and asked if she wanted to see it. The protagonist, in turn, remarked that she didn't like places where there might be some bugs. Suddenly, his lordship turned to the butler and remarked that he must be tired after his trip. The head butler at this estate is named Kara. His Majesty remarked to her that she had indeed taken excellent care of the manor. Next, he asked that the woman find the architect and artisans and invite them to join them. The female interlocutor immediately afterwards apologized if it hurt him in any way, but she didn't understand why he needed those people. The man remarked that he understood perfectly well that there was no suitable place for a child in the house. Dvoretsky took this information about the child with surprise. At the same time, turned her attention to the girl. The heroine, too, noticed her surprised look and greeted her, stating that her name was Léonie. His Majesty, in turn, remarked that she was mispronouncing her name, for how should she remember the name he had given her much longer without sparing it? The girl inquired if she could really call him by that name. The man asked if she planned to introduce herself after all, without even using her own last name. The heroine immediately let out her gaze and thought about it. Afterward, she turned to the butler and stated that her name was Léonie Boreotti. And so when she did, this man immediately put his hand to her head and started stroking it gently. The girl was surprised because of this, and then very much embarrassed, because she liked it quite a lot. Kara, in turn, continued to stand and did not understand what was happening at the moment. She realized that this picture in front of her was really beautiful, but she still didn't understand anything about the situation. She pondered for a while, and then turned to His Majesty. She remarked that she would tell her to prepare another batch of food for their cook. And on the way, she thought once more about the fact that something told her it was going to be quite noisy here for a while. After all this, a huge pile of gossip as well as rumors spread throughout the manor. The first to start discussing the situation were the cooks who were working in the kitchen. The maids were also discussing it, saying that the Duke had brought some child with him. To all this, all the other subordinates as well as the laborers were also discussing it. They were saying that who could have imagined that His Majesty the Duke himself would be holding a little girl in his arms. But if one looked at this little girl so closely, one would realize that she had black hair. Several maids were heatedly discussing all this and asking each other if the Duke was having an affair somewhere. A companion asked her if this girl really thought his lordship was single with that face. Another maid remarked that he had a rather creepy look, and that was why it was difficult for him to find a companion. Her companion remarked that his lordship was not afraid of him at all. The protagonist ran up to the maids and greeted them cheerfully. She noticed that her name was Leonie Boreati. The maids looked at her and thought that she was really so cute. But while they were looking at the girl, the head butler came up. She immediately addressed the maid named Connie, and the girl approached her. Next, the woman inquired if this girl wanted to become a personal maid for the mistress. The girl remarked that she did indeed want that. Further, her interlocutor noticed that this girl had suffered a lot. That's why she asked to be attentive to the little lady. The maid thought about it and really decided that she was too skinny. Now, she remarked to her companions that the young lady's big eyes were really so cute. One of her interlocutors remarked that all the little ones were indeed very cute. But it turns out that in any case, the Duke brought her here. After a while, the head butler was in His Majesty's room. He told the woman about what had happened and who the little girl was. The woman was shocked and wondered what his lordship was thinking. So it turns out he only adopted her out of his own whim. It's still too irresponsible, and he at least thought about what will be common with the girl in the future. His Majesty, for his part, rose from his seat and walked to the window. He did not answer anything to his interlocutor and looked at how the girl was playing. The protagonist, for her part, was happily playing with the snow that was around her. She was quite carefree as well as joyful, and there was no trace of that frightened, angry girl anymore. There was also a maid there beside her. The woman at the same time kept telling him that the child was not some pet after all. But the man's actions at literally the same time look like he is treating her like a kitten you got for some games. The man looked at her with anger and asked if she thought he didn't understand anything right now. Butler in turn added that otherwise he would not have adopted the little girl so unconsidered. Immediately afterward, they exchanged angry glances with each other. The man next to him remarked that it was more important to find out if she was indeed not his own daughter. His Majesty declared, in turn, not to make him repeat himself twice. That night then began his musings on the fact that, first of all, the little girl has black hair. Such black hair, only members of the Boreati family have such a rich shade only. Suddenly, the Duke of the same family takes custody of the girl, and as a consequence, she has black hair like tar. After that, rumors spread quickly, and people will begin to hypothesize that the child was born of his lordship. The Duke in turn began to say first of all, they should make the girl gain weight. At the same time, he stated that you have not also stopped pelting him with silly questions. Kara sighed, and then inquired as to what he was planning on doing in the first place. His lordship inquired as to what she meant by those words, for he simply wanted to educate her. The woman remarked that that was certainly out of the question. At the same time, she thought that it was really happy that at least he takes care of the baby. And further stated that, for starters, they should quiet down all those people who spread rumors about him, as well as the child. The woman in turn invited some merchants to buy things for the young mistress. The rumors have most likely already spread throughout the duchy. Therefore, she wondered how the man was going to solve the problem after all. He first hesitated for a while, and then turned his head towards the protagonist. The girl continued to play carefree with the maids, and smiled rather brightly and sweetly. This caused the man to smile as well. Next, he noticed that the girl was already running everywhere, as if she had spent her whole life in this house. The people he was talking to were shocked at how carefree he was being about it all, and shocked that their duke was smiling. Next, the man remarked to them that for now, let them leave it at that. The girl wanted to remark something to him, but he immediately threw his cold stare at her. Then she thought for a few seconds, and then lowered her gaze. And in doing so, she noticed that these people can still insult a little girl behind her back. After all, people are cruel, and it is not difficult for them to make an outcast out of the girl and say all sorts of nasty things about her behind her back. His Majesty remarked that no one would dare to insult her openly unless they wished to die a painful death. If that really happens, that's when he won't just kill them. If such a man does appear and dares to do all this, then he will honor him by bathing his sword in his blood. Immediately after that, she turned and left his office. But behold, after a while, His Majesty's office was knocked upon. The man introduced himself and remarked that his name was Mouse. The man stated to go to his office. Then this knight entered and greeted His Majesty. He also stated that the troop was already waiting for him to leave. The man looked at him and stated that their long-awaited guests had finally arrived. The girl was returning to the afterwalk and tried to open the door on her own, but the maids noticed that they would open it themselves for the mistress, though the girl noticed that it was fine and she would open it. Another maid inside noticed that were approached her and inquired if she had fun. The heroine stated that she had a lot of fun. There was so much snow piled up to her ankles. It was like she was drowning in it every time she took a step. Next, they continued to undress her, and the maid noticed that there was really a lot of it. So she wondered if perhaps she should ask aloud in order to clear the paths. The girl cheerfully remarked that she should not do so, for she liked the snow very much. She, in turn, is going to make a huge snowman next time. Hello. After that, the cook came over and noticed that since the wife had a lot of fun, she needed a good meal. He remarked that the girl should try this focaccia from the chef himself. The girl was very enthusiastic when she saw it, and so she thanked him immediately. The interlocutor remarked for her to gobble on her health and enjoy it. Little by little, the little girl started savoring it, and it was evident that she liked it a lot. Therefore, the girl shouted that it was simply delicious. The cook, with a smile on his face, said that she was eating more and was not shy at that. For a while, the heroine continued to do so. But suddenly, this place they were in, a knight entered and addressed the mistress. The girl turned her attention to her and stated that it was already Sister Meles. Immediately after that, the girl started running up to her. After that, the two embraced, and the interlocutor asked if she had fun exploring the mansion. The girl happily stated that it was. The knight remarked that she shouldn't talk to her so politely after all, and the little girl stated that she was used to talking to her like that after all. Then Mel said that it was simply not proper for a lady of the House of Boreati to address one of her knights so politely. The girl at once declared that she had worked so hard to take the place. To the interlocutress, this seemed rather sweet. Therefore, took the girl's hand, immediately kissed it, and with a smile on her face, noticed that the Duke was looking for her. Because of the fact that the protagonist heard this, then immediately became wary. At that, she wondered if the man would again ask to do something in a repulsive, cute way. The knight remarked that she thought she would like it after all. After a while, they did go to the place the Duke had called them to. The girl was presented with a gift, and it was a horse that obliged with a bow. She was shocked about it and wondered what the hell it was. The maids were discouraged over this and were chatting with each other. One of them was telling the person she was talking to that it seems like the two are actually related, although literally even talking like the Duke himself. It was incomprehensible to them how they could be so similar. The knight was also happy for all the rumors she had heard. His Majesty, for his part, turned to his daughter and told her that when she received a gift, she should give thanks, not yell. The girl remarked that this was too much, and the man said that since he had given her a gift, he had one request for her in return. Further, pointing his finger, he asked her to do at least something nice once a day. The girl was a little discouraged by this question. That's why she asked what he would do to her if she still refused to do it. The father stated that it would mean that he was not raising her well. Still, she shouldn't worry about it at all, because he will kick her out because of such a small thing. The protagonist noticed her father to tell her honestly whether he was a pervert. The man touched her forehead and asked when she would start calling him daddy already. The girl was a little embarrassed and remarked that she would try though. There were several attempts to portray a cute demeanor, but nothing worked. After all, the man said that he didn't quite like it. Then he asked the girl to give him her hand. The heroine set it up, and he immediately threw a candy bar there. The girl was embarrassed about it and looked at it animatedly. The man, in turn, declared that it was her reward. So it comes out that he will give gifts, and every time she behaves nicely. For the Knight, this whole situation was quite strange, because she could not imagine that the Duke would be with a strawberry milk candy. When the little girl was in the Knight's arms, she asked why the old man suddenly called out to her. When the interlocutor heard this, she immediately changed her face, so much so that she even turned her gaze away. The girl tried to attract her to her by using her hand and asked her why she was angry. The girl remarked that it was because of the unwanted guests. The heroine asked, but why she did not like them after all. And then the interlocutor remarked that it was all because of the fact that they were mocking her lady. She further remarked with anger in her voice that her master asked her to bring the girl, but honestly, she is worried. The Knight is afraid that if the girl sees them again, it might hurt her lady. If the girl still doesn't want to go there, she will take her to her own room. But as a consequence of that, she would just explain the whole situation to his lordship for her. His Majesty was downstairs in his manor. All those people who had been involved in the abuse at the orphanage were also brought in. He scrutinized the papers his subordinate had provided him. The Duke asked his subordinate what had happened to the orphanage. The latter, in turn, remarked that it had simply burned down. They were told that as a result of the fire killed all the people who were inside. At this thought, though they should have died, only those who were now in this very place. He went on to say that the fire was a fatal event for the children, as well as their teacher, Miss Connie. Still, they were going to move them all to the duchy, if they didn't move out, of course. Not increased noticed that he understood everything. They could have saved them if they had arrived a little earlier. Literally, immediately at that moment, the man burned the papers he held in his hands. He looked very angrily at all the people in front of him. Those people looked at His Majesty with horror, realizing what might be ahead of them. The Boreati had always been the dominant force of the North, and they caused even the royal family to be in awe. There are many reasons for all of this, but one in particular stands out among all of them. It is the beast Fang that all people feared. The aura of a swordmaster can only be comprehended by those who have honed their martial skills to incredible heights. The foundation of magic, on the other hand, is mana. Even so, another Fang is unlike any of these powers. His Majesty's subordinates looked at the Duke and saw that he had used his ability. Therefore, he realized that those people were in no good danger. Suddenly, his musings were interrupted by a shout of someone addressing the Duke. They turned their attention there and saw the main character who was addressing the old man. She was now in the arms of the knight who had accompanied her all this time. Next, the girl missed the heroine, and she immediately rushed over. With joy on her face, the girl immediately began to run to her father. He was a little worried at that time for her, and noticed that she did not run, or she might fall. Next, he lifted the girl in his arms and asked her why this was so. After all, she was the fastest runner in the orphanage. The man remarked that apparently it would only come to her when he broke his nose. The protagonist immediately wondered why he was so serious. The father, in turn, noticed that, in addition, it turns out that she often ran away from the orphanage. The little girl noticed that this was so because teachers, as well as educators, always tried to beat her. Suddenly, she turned her attention to the side, and there she noticed all of them. To all this, there stood His Majesty's subordinates. With joy on her face, the girl noticed that it was Mr. Secretary. The boy, in turn, immediately paid attention to her. Next, he bowed to Mrs. Leonier and remarked that he was pleased to see her again. Next, he asked that she just pelt him with rupees. Also, he was very happy to see that she was really doing well. The girl smiled and remarked that she was eating very well and also sleeping very well. The interlocutor remarked that she was doing really well. Suddenly, someone called Nia's name. The girl became alert and turned her attention there. The caretakers started saying that it was wishful thinking and not so worried about her. Someone said he missed her, and no one thought more of her than he did. Also wondered why she hadn't contacted them, since they were worried about whether she was eating well. Someone didn't recognize her at all, and remarked that she had gotten so really pretty. Suddenly, the girls were approached by the principal and noticed that it was him. This person stated Antony the day she came to the orphanage, and it was a very hot summer. She was so small, just like some kind of mouse, and he was the one who gave her the name. The girl, in turn, turned to the old man, not realizing what was going on. His Majesty set her down on the ground and noticed, in a state, people came to her. Being her father, it was his duty to take care of them. To all this thinking, the girl would like to talk to her before he helps them get on the path of truth. The protagonist wondered with surprise, but why should there be such a thing? His Majesty the Duke remarked that perhaps she wanted to free some of them from his lessons. The girl immediately afterward pondered his words. She thought about it for a few seconds, and after that, she looked at the rest of the people. Next, she angrily wondered why she should forgive them at all. The teachers were horrified at what they had just heard about the girl. She, in turn, called them crazy assholes who were rambling on and on. Immediately after that, she took off one of the boots she had Zone wear and smiled happily, stated that she wished them a happy torture time. After that, she approached one of the women and hit her on the head. Noticed that it was the same teacher who pinched her hands every day. Next, she approached another man and also hit him on the head. After that, she noticed that this man boasted about hitting the children every day with a leather belt. Next in line was the next teacher, whom she also hit on the head with a shoe. And after that stated that this teacher spent the funds that were intended for the orphanage on his own affairs with different girls. At last, the heroine approached the director of the orphanage herself. With anger in her voice, she remarked that they all investigated to live quite honestly. Further stated to the director that he was really right. After all, it turns out that she and the director have so many common memories. After that, the girl began to wonder why he was bullying them. After all, adults like him and teachers should take care of children, not the other way around. It was incomprehensible why they didn't do that. She kept asking why they did such things to little children. Then she threw her shoe right in front of them, noticing that the orphanage was in the fall, not the summer. Still, he could at least remember that from her. After a few moments, the girl pulled out a box and opened it. His Majesty the Duke looked at it and wondered with surprise what it was. The heroine remarked with a smile on her face that it was a gift for their guests. The man continued to stare at her in amazement until he heard music. It turned out to be a music box that the girl had brought to play for them. She further remarked that it was a requiem for these people. Hearing all this, His Majesty's subordinate was shocked. He asked if this girl was not really his daughter. The head butler heard this and immediately gestured for him to cover his mouth. The boy did so and wondered if that black hair as well as character was very similar to his lordship. The girl, for her part, kept saying that there was no way she would let them go. They are very nasty to her after all, and the girl thinks that they will go to the most evil devils in hell. The teachers were horrified when they heard this from the little girl and realized what will happen to them next. The heroine further stated that it was very cool because the stress that had been accumulating for decades disappeared as if by magic of her. Her father remarked, "But she's only 7 years old, how can she?" The little girl stated that it was figurative. Didn't he hear anything about metaphors? Immediately after these words, the man took a candy bar out of his pocket and held it out to the girl. The heroine turned her attention to it and looked at it with surprise. Surprised, she was of this, that she noticed that she had not done anything nice today. But His Majesty noticed what she had done cute. The little girl wondered if he was now talking about the present situation. She wondered if he thought mocking people, which was pretty cute. The man in turn patted her on the head and remarked that she acted like a real Boreati. After that, the little girl hesitated for a while, and His Majesty looked at her. But then she raised her gaze, smiled at him. Because of that, the Duke also smiled, for it was quite cute for him. At the same time, the maids came up to them, who rejoiced because of this and said that their lady was irresistible. Also, the knight and the head butler were sympathizing because of this situation. Roop looked at all of them with astonishment. At that, he immediately thought, was he the only person who was not moved by this? He wondered if he was the odd one out, or if they were the odd ones out. After that, they all headed out of that room. His Majesty was carrying the girl in his arms. Suddenly, she turned to him and remarked that there was only one thing but. She asks him that he cannot kill them quickly. The father, in turn, stated that he would not do something so wasteful. The girl remarked that it is right to squeeze all the juices out of them before they die. The man asked her where she got such thoughts from, and the young girl remarked that it was from the orphanage. Further down the road, she began to say that she had a great idea. they need to get a teacher and a rope and throw them all off a cliff. Just like that, they will fly down and fall until they pull the rope sharply. Immediately after that, their bodies will start expressing like my glasses up and down. But after that, there will be a blow in the rope, and they will collapse to the ground with their own bodies. The man thought about it and noticed that she had really thought it out well. There is a suitable cliff nearby for the plans she has just voiced. The girl in turn declared that he should not be too harsh. After all, they must survive to experience the rest of the joys of torture. Immediately afterward, they promised each other on their toes, and the girl declared that she would punch him if he broke his promise and killed them before. His Majesty's subordinate was horrified by the situation. Now he thought that nothing could be changed in any case. Next, he thought for a second about the situation that had happened earlier. About that situation, after which the Duke stood near the broken carriage and said that Regina was no longer Boreati. And while the boy was pondering the situation, the head butler came up to him. She asked him if he noticed any similarities with Mrs. Regina. The guy was surprised because she also said that, and said that he soon believed that the girl comes with the daughter of the Duke. So it turns out when they first met, the child's behavior was perfectly normal for a waif. She did not resemble Mistress Regina at all, but now, anyone who looks at the little girl will immediately think that this is the very same Boreati's favorite. The same thoughts he had whenever he saw that woman. She always had a rather bright smile on her face when she addressed him. Now the guy understood all this, but he thought that they were completely different in appearance. His Majesty's subordinates remarked to the interlocutor that Lady Regina was really dead. Once, when the territories of the duchy were flooded by heavy rains, Madame escaped, and it was with the man she loved. He was waiting for her at the exit of the estate, and then together they rode in a carriage. But lo and behold, as they were riding in that very carriage, their carriage overturned on one of the slopes and fell right into a cliff. Rupa stated that he ended up personally investigating the very same carriage that had been blown over by a cell on the day of their escape. The woman immediately thought about the situation and stated that no bodies had been found after all. But if those two people had survived the disaster and left the land of Boreati, it was possible that the girl could have been their daughter. After a while, His Majesty the Duke was in the bathroom. Various thoughts tormented his head. He recalled Madame Kara's words that the child was not a pet. For some reason, it was those very words of hers that would not come out of the man's mind. After a while, he began to climb out of the bathtub and thought, from whatever angle the word pet represents something small. At the same time, he thought that this statement sounded offensive to some animals. To all of this, he wondered how a little girl even knew what a requiem was. Even children, various nobility, as well as aristocrats, do not know such words. Also, considering that the girl had lived in the orphanage for all 5 years, she had excellent vocabulary. Because of this, the man immediately wondered if she might be a genius. After a while, he came out of the bathroom to his office. A subordinate was there and immediately greeted his lordship. The man looked at him in surprise and inquired whether he had authorized him to leave here. Immediately afterward, His Majesty seated himself at the table. He already had food set at this time, so he was ready for the meal. Next, he looked at his subordinate and remarked, of course he looked bad. The subordinate, in turn, thought that while the Duke was chilling here, he was doing his job. His Majesty at this time angrily averted his gaze. Next, the lad apologized for entering without knocking at his door. He remarked that, to put it first, he had come because he had some really important information for him. His Majesty, in turn, indicated for him to take a seat. And so they sat down and wanted to discuss all this already, when suddenly someone knocked on his front door. They immediately turned their attention there, and it was the protagonist, who wondered at the old man if he was here. When the girl did not hear the answer, bluntly wondered if he was not here. Next to the girl at the time was her maid, who noticed that it seems his lordship is still taking a bath. It appeared that she had seen the servants preparing a bath for him, so they should probably come back later. The little girl, in turn, remarked that she would simply wait for him. She turned to her sister and asked if she was afraid of the Duke. She was surprised to hear this question, and remarked that his lordship, Duke Boreati, is the ruler of the north. He is the strongest person in the world, so it is normal to feel fear of such a person. Even more so to feel fear of people like her. because it's natural for servants to feel fear. The heroine asked why the old man was so kind to her. The interlocutor said that it was because his lordship cared a lot for the girl. Then she remarked that if that was true, she felt very pleased because of it. His Majesty immediately smiled sweetly when he heard all those words. Next, the heroine cried out, "What if the old man still remained single because of her? And what would happen then?" His Majesty and his subordinates immediately became wary after hearing this. The maid, in turn, noticed that his lordship was indeed very popular with the girls. The little girl said that he still shouldn't rely only on his own face, as he should become a little kinder, and also still do something about his terrible character. The subordinate just thought that he could no longer hold back laughter, even at the risk of his own life. The girl, for her part, kept saying perhaps he should be fed. He was always acting like some cranky child. Now, the maid too was now holding back laughter. The Duke could not stand it at this, and immediately headed for the exit of the room. He, in turn, opened the door abruptly as he approached her. The maid was startled when she saw this, and the girl remained where she was. As she did so, she wondered to the old man if he was really here after all. Then it was unclear why he had been hiding all this time. The man, at the same time, he was without outerwear, and the heroine paid attention to this. When she noticed it, it immediately began to shout that her old man was half naked and Mr. Rupee was on the couch. To her, it really seemed rather strange. The maid immediately shouted to my lady that she had really misunderstood everything. The man turned inside and noticed with you, the girl was leaving. She turned to him at His Majesty, noticing that things were not as she thought. The heroine turned to him again, but he interrupted her again and noticed that she was wrong now. Next, he stopped and asked the girl if he really looked like this kind of man. The protagonist remarked to the old man not to worry, because it is really not sinful to love, even if this love is for a man. The interlocutor immediately pumped, becoming wrongly understood. After that, he asked if the girl thinks that he will lose popularity because he has a child. The heroine immediately hesitated because of these words. Next, she looked in different directions and noticed that he should always think about a suitable couple. The man stated that he didn't have time for that right now. The girl asked why that was, so did all this happen just because of her? In response, His Majesty hesitated a bit and then said that he was simply not interested in anyone. The protagonist wondered what he was going to do. The Duke immediately wondered why he should even talk to her about it now. Next, he pushed all these thoughts out of his head and headed over to the girl in order to pick her up. When the little girl saw this, she immediately reached for him and got excited. And all this because she really liked the body of her so-called father. The man, in turn, saw her animated face and realized the whole situation. So he immediately turned in the other direction and put on a robe that was not far away. But after that, he still took the girl in his arms. The heroine was indignant and asked why he still put on the robe. The father asked, "But why even such a question now?" The girl in turn stated that she had spent so much energy just for contemplation. The man in turn was shocked and remarked that he too did not think he would live to see such a moment, when he would be molested by his own daughter. The protagonist remarked that he should not think about it and let him give her another look. His Majesty, in turn, tried to change the subject and asked why she had come here after all. The heroine began to rummage in her pockets and noticed that she remembered everything. Next, she pulled out a bag of cookies and stated that she was going to give this to him. With a happy smile on her face, she said that she did it for him for doing a good job in the dungeon. They had baked these cookies together with the chef, and the girl thought that the chef would be tired, so she would eat them to cheer him up. After all, it just so happens that when they first met, he gave her a candy bar, and the girl, though she would pay him back in kind. The man took one look at those cookies and then stated that apparently she baked them using ingredients that were bought with his money. The heroine immediately got angry and remarked that she didn't like it when the man was being mean. If he really wasn't going to eat them after all, then let him give them back. The girl tried to take the cookies away from him, and His Majesty remarked, "Who said he wasn't going to eat them after all?" But the heroine said that she simply does not want to give him the cookies because he is behaving disgustingly. She doesn't understand. And so what if it was done for his money? If she didn't have a penny, would he really be happy? His Majesty inquired if the little girl had forgotten, for his money belonged to her too. The girl immediately afterward tried to make a cute face for him, changed the old man that she was joking. His Majesty's subordinate looked at them with astonishment and thought that the two were exactly suited for each other. He wondered if they had forgotten about his presence and were talking to each other like that. After a while, the protagonist left His Majesty and waved to him. The man turned to his office and saw his subordinate. Further, he noticed him that he was still here, so what brought him here after all? Rupee was startled and thought that, as expected, His Majesty had forgotten that he was standing here waiting for him. Next, he stated that he wanted to tell him something very important. The interlocutor declared that he should tell and not procrastinate. His Majesty, for his part, was eating a cookie, and a smile appeared on his face because of it. The subordinate thought for a few seconds, and then remarked that the talk would now be about Lady Leonie. The maid was putting the protagonist to bed after a while. The little girl inquired of her whether His Majesty should like these cookies. The interlocutor remarked that of course he should like it, for after all the liege had baked it personally. She further stated that the girl had had quite a busy day today. Also, the mistress did indeed look very unrivaled today. The heroine asked if that was really true. The interlocutor, with a smile on her face, stated that of course it was true. Well, now it would be time for her to rest and sleep. Also, if there is anything we'll need, let her simply call the bell, which the girl will now give her. The heroine took it in her hands and immediately tried it in action. The maid remarked that this bell was a magical object and all the servants would hear it. Next, she showed the bracelet and asked if she could see it. All the roomers and the maid just like that can catch the ringing of this bell with the help of this bracelet. The girl immediately noticed that it was very unusual indeed. Her companion said that she thought so too, just as she did. But still, this device is quite expensive to use. So she said that she would leave the bell here so that the girl could contact her and wish her pleasant dreams. And so, after a while, the maid left the room and made the girl alone with her thoughts. The heroine tried to fall asleep and at the same time looked at the bell that she had on her locker. She realized that she had already seen children playing with such things. But thinking back on the whole situation, there were kids who were dressed up in red cloaks and holding bells. But here was the girl realizing that she had seen all of this in her past life. His Majesty's subordinate, for his part, was telling him that the conversation would concern the birth of Lady Leonie. His Majesty immediately looked at him and asked if they were still talking. The interlocutor thought for a few seconds, and then stated that he thought they should investigate the whole thing thoroughly. The man asked, "But why on earth would they do that?" Roop asked so he wouldn't take offense at all the words he would hear. The Duke immediately stated that it was not necessary after all. Then the aide remarked that he was pleading with him, and he would stake his life on it. Next, His Majesty asked if he was going to give his promise even on his little fingers. The interlocutor immediately afterward remarked that he thought there might be some connection between Lady Leonie and Lady Regina. Immediately afterward, he prepared himself to hear aggression against him. But the interlocutor hesitated for a few seconds and remarked that Regina was dead. The subordinate afterward stated that even though he thought so, he had not so much as found her body. If the lady as well as her lover escaped the worst end, then it is possible that Lady Leonie could be their daughter. If this does happen, they would immediately eliminate the rumors of the girl being an illegitimate child. His Majesty immediately hesitated and remarked that it was clear to him. At the same time, he added that if he were to be honest, he was also thinking of investigating Leonie's past. The interlocutor stated that he understood that perfectly well. The Duke said that the subordinate's research still convinced him not to do it. After all, it turns out that they met the girl in the orphanage after all. The aide remarked that this is just another reason to figure out who her parents are after all. The man then inquired as to what that knowledge would get them to, further asking if he was going to tell her that they knew who her parents were, but they were dead. And even if she is in reality Regina's daughter, such a thing is clearly not good for the child. She is then the daughter of a woman who ran off with a chosen one that the family didn't approve of, the illegitimate child of the Empire's most powerful man and Lord of the North, Duke Boreati. If one were to still choose between the two options, then, unequivocally, anyone would decide that the second option was more promising. The subordinate immediately lowered his gaze and noticed that he had indeed made a mistake. His Majesty, in turn, added that he had thought things through, one step ahead after all. Roop was a little shocked and asked what he meant by that now. His lordship stated that he simply hadn't thought about the fact that Regina's daughter might actually be there. He next asked the assistant if he thought that, in his opinion, Leonie resembled Regina. The interlocutor thought for a while after this, and then stated that, to be frank, he should say that they were dissimilar. At that, he thought that the girl probably resembled the Duke himself to an uncanny degree. The non-driver went on to say that confirming the little girl's lineage wouldn't be difficult after all. The moment they had first met in the orphanage, a child whose black eyes sparkled brighter than gold had appeared before the man. It was because of that this time that he thought it was an uncontrollable flow of mana, but it actually turned out that the man was indeed mistaken. And so it turns out that this was nothing but direct proof that the girl is Boreati. Sometime after that, the protagonist together with His Majesty sat at the table. They were eating, but the heroine did not really want to eat, and just looked at the food that was in her plate. Her mood was quite good. The Duke was also munching on his food, but his look was rather pensive. When he cut a piece of meat on his plate, he immediately turned to Leonie. He then gave the girl a taste of the piece and remarked that they would try her springy idea next time. The girl liked it and immediately thought of this setup. She had already visualized how it would be accomplished and already wanted to patent the idea. The girl wondered if it was all because of the weather. His Majesty said that the Ice Knights could be hurt by the weather, and that's why they should hold the whole thing tomorrow. That's why they should do it all tomorrow. After a while, the heroine jumped down from her chair. The maid put the children on her shoulders, clothes, and the girl immediately thanked. Next, she looked at her appearance and noticed that she looked like Superman. The interviewer asked who she was even talking about now. The protagonist stated that she looked like a man who wore his underwear over his clothes. She was horrified to be asked if such perverts really existed. The girl remarked that this man is not a pervert, he just wears panties over his clothes. One could say that this is his personal preference. His Majesty remarked that only some sodomites do that. At the same time, he remembered how the heroine constantly called him an old pervert, and thought, if the girl after such conversations calls him a pervert. The girl further stated that clothes are completely irrelevant to Superman. The important aspect of him is his body, his broad shoulders, as well as his powerful chest. His Majesty wondered if glass was part of his essence for now. The heroine went on to say, in turn, that he could be so lovely as well as strong at the same time. They walked down the road, and the girl rejoiced, imagining that she was indeed Superman. The man remarked that if she kept running like this, she would break her nose. If she kept it up like that, though. After a while, they were in a room together and were having a good time. The maid approached the protagonist and remarked to the little lady that here was her book. The girl thanked her politely and then began to read. His Majesty immediately looked at this book and saw that the title was Meaningless Life. Because of this, he was dumbfounded, for he didn't understand how a little girl could like such a thing. Then he asked, what about fairy tales? And the girl declared that only little children read such books, as he said. But the Duke remarked that it was children of her age who should like such things. The girl remarked that she was almost finished reading the book anyway. The interlocutor thought it looked as if only she had just started reading it. Next, he inquired as to whether the little girl had found the book. The little girl declared that she had found it in her father's library. After all, he had said that she could borrow anything she wished there. His Majesty was surprised and asked why she had chosen this particular book. The protagonist said that she only chose it because the title was quite interesting to her. Also, from her personal experience, she could tell that there really is no meaning in life. His Majesty immediately thought about these words. He thought that the girl had realized the harsh reality very quickly, and apparently, life in the orphanage was really quite hard. So he turned to Leonie and asked if she would like to see her real parents someday. The heroine called him an old man again, and remarked that she had absolutely no idea who they were. She further lowered her gaze and added that she doesn't remember anything except living in an orphanage. To all of this, it turns out that her only parent at the moment is him. The girl was actually well aware that she knew nothing about her real parents. To all this, she has no feelings for people she couldn't even remember. Of course, it is sad for her that she will never know about her origins. And also, in turn, it turns out that she will never meet the people thanks to whom she came into this world. The girl thought for a while, and then turned to His Majesty. From him, she inquired if there was anything she needed to try to remember about it. The man took her in his arms again, and remarked that there was nothing wrong if she forgot everything. Immediately afterward, he pulled out a borderline milky candy bar and fed it to the girl. He further stated that she at least remembered that he was the one who was now her family. Even though he already thought she had forgotten that, didn't she call his words daddy? The girl chimed in that it was all because she still hadn't checked in order to call him that. The interlocutor stated that this excuse was really outdated. The babe then got more angry and yelled out, does he really want her to flag him down? But when she did, the man simply sat quietly and did not react in any way. This was where the girl stopped and immediately pretended to pout. To His Majesty, this was really quite cute. After a while, the father turned to the girl and asked that she let him look at her eyes. The heroine immediately turned to him and wondered if he wanted to play peekaboo. And so because of this, for a while, they looked into each other's eyes. The girl watched in amazement as His Majesty's eyes changed, for some red tint appeared in them. The man used his beast skill at the same second, and the girl's eyes turned yellow immediately after that. The little girl felt some sort of discomfort in her eyes, so she immediately started rubbing them and turned to the old man with surprise. The latter, in turn, turned his attention to the maids who were in the room and declared to them to all go out. Immediately afterward, the maids bowed to His Majesty and began to go out. After a time, he did not leave the room and closed the door behind him. The man was left alone with the girl and immediately addressed her. The first thing he stated was that he did not like to beat around the bush. Usually, if one withholds something for a long time, it is very difficult to ask with consequences when the truth is revealed. The girl was very surprised to hear these words. At the same time, she thought that apparently this man had encountered something like this before. The father went on to say that he would now be completely honest with her, and further stated that it seems that the girl is his niece. The heroine's facial expression immediately began to change in a negative direction. She was shocked. With a rather discouraged face, she remarked that she was an ordinary orphan. After all, the old man himself should know quite well that he had taken her from the orphanage just recently. At that, she wondered, and what he would order her to do after such a revelation now. The man in turn remarked that despite everything, she had certain traits that were unique to the Boreati family. The girl exhaled and remarked that it was probably just some coincidence. His Majesty, in turn, touched her hair, and further remarked that black hair was an ancestral trait of the Boreati family. It also turns out that she was the intrepid child who was the gamekeeper who got in his way and deliberately activated her fangs. Because of the very gleam in the girl's eyes at that moment, the man thought it was a normal flow of mana. For the sake of their defense, young wizards often release mana. He didn't do it subconsciously for his own protection. Still, this was definitely not the case. Earlier, the man had inquired if the girl should mean what fangs were. She remarked that it does when his eyes change color and bloodlust begins to emanate from him. The interlocutor stated that she didn't consciously use her ability already when they first met, and all this happened because there was a resonance between their villages. The little girl had been dumbfounded and had asked the glow then, just now, if it was that resonance. But now it was unclear to her why she was not completely unafraid at the moment. The man stated that she in turn should not have been scared now. After all, he only wanted to see if she had this ability. It turns out that people who have the lion claw ability when using the power resonate. The girl was even more dumbfounded by this and asked if this meant that she was the real Boreati. Subsequently, she looked at her hands and started touching her cheeks. She further asked if she was definitely awake now that he was telling her all this. The man asked if she necessarily had to pinch her cheeks at the moment. The heroine was immediately wary and asked, then, if it worked out that way, who was her mother? The man thought for a few seconds and then remarked that her mother was his cousin. This girl was the most annoying person in the world. Right now, when remembering this girl, a picture of her smiling rather brightly and addressing him popped up in Duke's eyes. The Barria of the Black Beast was exactly the name of a novel that the protagonist enjoyed reading in her past life. It was the story of the Lord of the North called Duke Bariotti and his indispensable companion, Countess Barria Erbanu. This book was the story of their beautiful love. It was the very work that ridiculed the commonly known rooftops, which made it more like a comedy. And so one day the main character woke up and was dumbfounded. The girl looked in different directions and saw that she had woken up in the night. When better examined the room at which you found yourself, you saw that there were other children there, and they were very dirty. Immediately after that, the girl tried to touch herself and saw that she too was not in the body she was in her previous life. That's why she was terrified about this situation. Next, her life flowed out as the life of an ordinary orphan or some slave in an orphanage. When the heroine woke up, she realized that she did not become a noblewoman as in sweet fantasy novels, and she is an ordinary orphan who must live her life. One day the girl was collecting firewood for her orphanage, but when she got closer to the orphanage, she saw that there was a carriage. So Us looked at it more closely and saw that there was a pattern there that was quite familiar to her. We immediately thought, is it really a black lion? So at the same time, the girl realized that this world was inside her favorite story. It happened the moment she saw the familiar crest on the carriage door, so she decided to take a chance. The girl thought that she would work as a maid for the Duke's castle, and it would be better for her than they are in that very orphanage. But it just so happens that the man decided to adopt her and noticed that now she will be called Leonie Boriotti. Now His Majesty says that in all likelihood she is his niece. In the end, the girl could not have imagined that everything would turn out like this. That is why now she sat in terror and thought whether it was good that she was a niece or not. Still, she simply couldn't recall right now whether or not there was something like this in the original. Moreover, is it possible for you to heap such secrets on a child during morning games? Sometime after the conversation, the heroine ran away with the main butler. The woman was very tired at that moment and asked my lady to please wait for her for a second. Further stated that she should not run so fast because she could fall and then hurt herself. But the girl, as fast as she could, tried to run to the room. And when they entered there, the heroine immediately locked the door behind her. All this happened because His Majesty remarked to her that if she wanted to know details about the whole situation, let her ask Kara. The woman was now alert and was asking the heroine what had happened. The girl, in turn, remarked to her that she would like to ask her something that should remain just between them. Butler suggested that they sit down to begin with. Immediately they sat down, and the woman remarked to the girl what she wanted to discuss after all. The little girl noticed that the Duke had told her something. The interlocutor asked in surprise what it was that he had told her. The heroine said that he told a story about the very woman who gave her life. The interlocutor sadly missed her gaze and noticed that she realized that he had believed her all this. But suddenly she came to her senses and asked what it was all about. The woman was horrified at what had happened between her and the Duke. Next, the girl stated that His Majesty told her that her mother owed him a cousin. The butleress inquired, but how on earth could he have substantiated this to her? The little interlocutor replied that he had told her about the cages of the beast. He told her that the girl also possessed this ability. The woman was horrified by this story, and the girl went on to say that the old man had told her that her mother had them too. Then she saw the sad face of the woman in front of her and asked if she was crying and called her grandmother. Wiping away her tears, the woman apologized and said that the old woman was just a little sensitive. She thought that if that was the case, then it could only mean that Mrs. Regina was really dead. After that, she thanked the heroine for worrying about her. But the girl remarked that everything was fine. Next, she thought for a second and touched the cup that stood on the table. At that, she wondered if the Duke hated her mother. The woman at once remarked that he did not, for the matter was not out. Several times she repeated at once about Mrs. Regina, but could not say it to the end. The girl immediately thought whether Regina was the name of the woman who gave her life. Further still, the head butler continued the phrase that the mistress was a person of small mind. The girl was shocked by this. The interlocutor went on to say that she knew that she was certainly not someone who could say such a thing on Hertz, thought they as well. Certainly, for the girl was very kind as well as beautiful. The lady had all the traits of a romantic nature and tried to bring peace everywhere she went. As a result, she was a universal favorite. The girl thought that the lady did not understand when to speak out and when to keep silent. The old lady went on to say that Lady Regina was very fond of the Duke. Of course, she did not know whether it was because they were the only children in their families. Lady tried to be close to the Duke all the time, and she always tried to get close to him. It turns out that Regina's intentions were harmless, but it wasn't that simple. The girl understood the context, that this woman lived like some kind of pain in the ass. Now the heroine thought about how naive this woman was. Based on the experience the protagonist had gotten in the other world, there are no people more annoying than naive idealists. It turns out that the reason Regina wasn't in the novel is probably because Filio wasn't paying attention to her. He probably thought of his cousin as he did an annoying fly, always flying around and causing trouble. She was literally like some empty space for the Duke. Because of these thoughts, the girl felt very sorry for this woman. The protagonist also asked the interlocutor about what happened to her. The woman lowered her gaze and then noticed that she had run away. Lady Regina fell in love with a traveling knight, and naturally, the family was against their relationship. And so the lady decided to leave her family and also ran away with the man she loved. The girl realized that this was some kind of horror and thought it was better not to ask. Next, she wondered who such a mysterious wandering knight had answered. Probably it is obviously some nonsense that was invented by some scoundrel to make the story sound more romantic. The girl understood perfectly well that such nonsense even books do not write. It turns out that the story about a mysterious traveling knight does not even fit the genre of the main narrative. The woman carefully looked at the heroine and asked if my lady would ever want to see Lady Regina. The girl, for her part, answered nothing, and then smiled, declaring that she was grateful that the woman had told her everything. It turns out that this was the secret of her birth, which she could not help but be interested in. After some time, it was a dark night outside, and it was also snowing in the story. The heroine at this time was in a room with her father. The girl was sitting right next to the fireplace and reading a little book. Suddenly, she was approached by the Duke, who asked if she wasn't at all interested in who her parents were. The girl sighed and remarked that he didn't think she should care about people she couldn't even remember. She, for her part, didn't even want to think too much about the past and would rather focus on her own future. Immediately after that, she continued reading the book as if nothing had happened, and the man continued to lie there and stare at her. After a moment, His Majesty came closer to the girl and began to stroke her head. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked him what was wrong. He noticed that she was more like him than Regina in her judgments. With all these statements, he embarrassed the girl, and so she blushed. She further remarked that this was a good thing, for it meant that she was not stupid at all. The man smiled and continued to stroke her head. Suddenly, the heroine turned her attention to him and asked if she could see Miss Connie, as well as the rest of the orphans she lived with at the orphanage. His Majesty remarked that they had moved them to an orphanage within the Duchy of Boreati, so he would take her from there when the weather improved even a little. The girl immediately got excited and asked if it was true. If it was, he promised her, she remembered. His Majesty immediately smiled because of this. Next, the heroine turned her attention to him and asked the old man if he didn't have important things to do. She has such an impression, as if he is constantly idle and is only with her. The man said that she should take care of herself and that she should try to eat more carefully. He inquired if the girl is like some kind of pig. How unkempt and need to be put on her like that, such an apron. The heroine was very angry about this and shouted that this style is literally part of the image. His Majesty simply turned to the other side and noticed that she was covered in crumbs when she ate the appetizer. To top it all off, drool was flying in different directions. The girl remarked that it had only happened once, and the interlocutor said that he could eat without drooling, even if he had some of his teeth knocked out. The girl asked the old man if it was really that important for him to win every petty squabble. He remarked that the heroine should simply look up to her magnificent father and learn from him. The little girl asked what it was that she needed to learn from him, and the interlocutor stated that however it was, nonetheless, he would soon need to leave this estate. The girl was wary and asked why that was so. His Majesty, because of this, stated that very soon the season would come when the monsters would be most active. The protagonist asked, "But is it normal to use the word combination of active monsters in a conversation with a small child?" He, in turn, should be happy that the girl is developed, so Netmanami. The father stated that she, in turn, should also be glad that he is in no way all normal fathers. There are so many creepers living in Boreati's territory that their land is called a den of monsters. With that, he stood up, and the girl was immediately embarrassed at the sight of him. Next, he touched the girl with his finger and remarked that when the blizzard stopped, he would lead a campaign to reduce the number of monsters. After that, the heroine looked at him intently. He, in turn, also looked at her, and for a while they looked at each other like that. After that, the man asked her to turn around and turned her in the other direction. Immediately after that, he started playing with her hair. In the process, he noticed that their mission would end faster if it was quite sunny. But if it did start to storm, it would make things very difficult. So it turns out that in reality, the hike affects people more than monsters. And someday on one of these hikes, he will also take her with him. The girl looked at him with surprise, and her appearance was quite cute. So the man admired it at the time. The girl in turn inquired why he would take her away with him. The interlocutor said that she was his niece, and this was the main reason for her adoption. The protagonist was stunned by this and remarked to the old man whether he was going to continue to make impulsive decisions. She was quite curious as to when the man was going to get married after all. His Majesty noticed that in these, her parents are much more interesting than looking for a wife. The girl immediately started laughing brightly and remarked that it was probably all because of his connection to Rupi. The man immediately gave her an angry look and remarked that he would take away all of his favorite treats. Should she say something like that to him again? All of this was said rather darkly, and the heroine was immediately wary. Next, she noticed that it was only a joke after all. Suddenly, the room was entered by a maid who brought treats for the girl. When she put them on the table, that girl immediately thanked her sister for it. The main patient looked joyfully at the cookies and was enthusiastic, and the man noticed it. He further stated that if you think about it well, she was treating the servant quite respectfully. She looked at him in surprise at the remark that she did, and His Majesty declared that she did not even think of speaking to him in the least bit civilly. The heroine was horrified and asked if she really needed to be nice to him like that too. Let him just say it already if that's what he needs. His Majesty drank his drink and stated that it was annoying, so let her not do it. Still, let her work on correcting this habit. The girl remarked to him not to be hasty, for time would fix everything. Next, she asked the maid to hand her a book that was lying aside. The man in turn remarked that she was wrong, because only money will fix everything. The heroine, as well as the maid, paid attention to him, and he confirmed that indeed everything is decided by money. Next, he smiled and remarked that from now on, all the servants are fired. All the servants who heard all this were astonished. They could not believe the words of the gentleman who suddenly said all this. The heroine, in turn, was also shocked and asked why this was so, and His Majesty said that some rumor-monger dared to accept a respectful address to himself from a member of the Boreati family without reservation. And so he, as the head of this house, cannot turn a blind eye to a breach of discipline among his own employees. Even if he cut off their ears, it would simply not be enough. So, because of his great favor, he will punish them with mere dismissal. All the servants must immediately take their belongings and afterwards gather in the hall. The heroine, for her part, immediately barked out that she understood. She remarked that she would stop addressing them in a formal way to make him feel good. That said, it was grim, and she remarked that arming a child by firing the staff is a horror. This old man is less human than the monsters he is after. The man immediately afterward declared that this was still flowers. The girl asked what she was talking about. At this, she looked angrily at His Majesty, for he pissed her off a lot. She also now had that very lion's roar in her eyes. Then His Majesty turned to her and said that she should realize that there was no problem that could not be solved with money. The girl, in turn, settled down on the sofa on his leg and nibbled on a cookie. The man again remarked to her that, to cut to the chase, she should stop playing the seal. He would introduce her to the knight before they went on the raid. The girl asked, But hadn't the blizzard stopped? After all, he himself had said she needed to gain some weight. That's why she wouldn't budge now. The father stated that she must have excuses for everything. Next, he instructed the maids not to drop their clothes. And the heroine remarked in response to his words that he himself only wrinkles the sofa all the time. His Majesty picked up the girl and noticed that they had to go. Next, they walked through the corridors of the manor in which they lived. The man let go of the girl, and she walked with him, while scrutinizing him and thinking that she was Boriotti. And scrutinizing the father, the girl knew that he has a handsome face, but also a rather menacing aura. He is a typical hockey protagonist and has a rather nasty character. After these thoughts, the girl turned to the old man. Next, she asked if he would accidentally get rid of her when he had such a whim. He looked at her angrily and asked who it was that she thought he was now. Next, he looked at her, and the girl had a rather interested face. So the man turned to her and touched her nose with his finger. He noticed that Léonie was his daughter after all. That was why he would be responsible for her for the rest of his own life. The girl gulped because of this, and then immediately turned away. At this, it could be seen that she was greatly embarrassed, but said that she didn't like sheep who teased their own children. The man smiled because of this, for he liked it. Next, they headed down the road to a place they weren't going, and suddenly the girl stopped because she heard about a strong ringing, and it frightened her a little. So she stopped and looked in different directions, not realizing where the sound was coming from. His Majesty noticed that the girl hesitated and immediately picked her up in his arms. Next, pointing upwards, he asked her to look there. The girl turned her attention to the ceiling, and there was a huge lion engraved there. The heroine was stunned at this beautiful sight, and then asked what it was on the ceiling. His Majesty remarked that it was said that one of their ancestors had ordered a picture to be engraved there. The girl was soon disappointed, and remarked that she was somehow uncomfortable with it, for it looked like some illustration from nightmares. She further asked why the dome of the building was so tall. His Majesty stated that it would be problematic to fix a collapsed ceiling every time someone allowed a battle aura. The heroine asked in surprise what he was talking about now. The Duke stated that battle aura was a power that acquired by knights due to long and hard training. While a mage's mana is an innate spiritual ability, aura is an acquired one only after physical training. However, developing this skill requires the physical potential of perseverance as well as constant training. There are 3 knights in their order who can release this very aura. However, people with such skills are quite rare. The girl wondered, but could he also use this technique? His father remarked that he has something more powerful, so what's the point of him bothering with it? The heroine asked if he was talking about the beast Fang. His Majesty smiled proudly, confirming those words. The girl was shocked, noticing that he was so annoying, though that was even, as always. Her father remarked that she in turn had her ability as well, so she should learn how to use it. The protagonist remarked that he would be the first person to be scratched after her fangs were exposed. The interlocutor stated that he would be faster still. The girl added that before he realized what was happening, she would have time to grab his chest. Next, she tried to mimic this ability, and it was quite cute. The man was shocked at what she had said before, and asked why on earth she, being his daughter, was obsessed with people's bulges. The girl, too, was now stunned, and remarked that it was all wrong. Let him not make her look perverted after all. Then His Majesty realized that she was really aware of all this. Next, the little interlocutor declared for the old man to listen to her carefully. She simply likes all pumped-up muscles, and muscles are everything to her. She likes voluminous muscles, so that they are really pumped up, and she really likes muscular, handsome men. After that, she yelled about it for a long time that she loves it. At the same time, the knight who were in this room were practicing hard and long. They were fighting while honing their training. But suddenly, their attention was interrupted by a girl screaming that she loved muscles. One of the knights wondered if he had heard it. They immediately started whispering to each other about what she liked. Had she really said she loved muscles? Yet they all came to the conclusion that apparently she didn't. They wondered where that voice was coming from after all. Could it be that some pervert had infiltrated their training ground after all and was now watching them? At the same time, someone was walking down the hallway. They paid attention and saw His Majesty, who had a girl in his arms. When the knight saw his lordship, he immediately greeted him and offered his fist to his chest. The man looked at it, and also the protagonist scrutinized him. The Duke realized that something was amiss here, so he immediately remarked to the girl that Mono was married. She was shocked and asked why he was telling her that. And the interlocutor said that it was not for her that his muscles grew like this. The protagonist asked if he really wanted to see what she was like in her. Her father noticed that her breath didn't even hit her, so he thought he would need a little more time. Because of this, Rain stated that the old man must have started to regress. His Majesty stated that he, unlike her, was at least developing somehow. All of the knights were looking closely at the situation that was happening and were shocked. Suddenly, Mono interrupted all of this and declared a general attention. Immediately after that, the knights quickly oar each other and stood up to greet his lordship. The heroine scrutinized them and saw that Sister Melis was there. That's why she tried to get away from her father and wanted him to let her in. But still, she remained in his arms. Next, His Majesty began to say that all the knights had done a very good job indeed. The man remarked that he thought about introducing them before the monster hunt began. To his subordinates, he remarked to introduce themselves. This is his Tok, her name is Leonie, and to her he stated that these are the Knights of Glasgow who help guard his north. The first to introduce himself was the man who greeted them with His Majesty at the entrance. He noted that he is the vice captain and his name is Mono Serrero. He greets Lady Boreati on behalf of the entire Order of Knights. The girl, in turn, greeted them as well, and noticed that her name was Leonie Boreati. Next, she looked at her own father, waiting to see what kind of reaction she would get from him. The man in turn smiled and stroked her head. After that, he turned to his subordinates and inquired about the preparations for the raid. Mono noticed that during His Majesty's absence, there had been reports of cube monsters attacking several small settlements. It might be much more difficult to clear the lands of monsters this move than last year. His Majesty stated that the young creatures that had hatched not too long ago were even bloodier from the forest of their kin. The protagonist at the same time was not listening to His Majesty, but was simply looking at the other members of the order. She was looking at their pumped-up and muscular bodies, and that attracted her quite a bit. So she immediately turned to her old man and asked him to let her go. His Majesty did so and asked that she be by Melis's side. The girl inquired, but why was this so? And the interlocutor stated that this way, at least, she would not be able to embarrass people. The daughter immediately turned away from him and asked if he really thought she was perverted. The father remarked that if she wasn't, then why was she just giggling suspiciously like that? The little girl stated that she simply wanted to make friends and play with all these knights, and the interlocutor said that for that, she still needed consent from both sides. The girl took offense at him and immediately ran towards the knights, looking him in the eye. The first thing she did was actually rush into Melis's arms. Also, the rest of the knights stood there and greeted her. His Majesty watched intently as the girl carelessly enjoyed their time together. Suddenly, Mono turned to him. He noticed that the girl actually looked healthier than before. In fact, it was good that she was already used to this place. The man stood up and stated that this had been her home all along after all. The other knight remarked that the manor did indeed become very lively when this child arrived. When everyone socializes with them, they seem so enthusiastic. Next, the knight inquired if His Majesty had already entered the girl into the family registry. The one immediately noticed that she had already been entered a long time ago. The knights were a bit confused because of this. The heroine, in turn, asked Melis if she was feeling well that day. The interlocutor remarked that thanks to her, he felt fine, and further stated that the girl has really become much more beautiful. The babe inquired if she was disturbing them, at least for now. The knight stated, "Oh, of course not. It's not like you're always very happy to see her." The others would join in the conversation as well, and said there was no problem with that, as it was an honor to meet Lady Boreati. One of the knights remarked that, speaking of which, they had recently had a conversation with the Duke about something. Therefore, they wondered if the girl really liked muscles that much. The girl immediately shouted out that she did, because she was crazy about them. A knight with red hair remarked that she really is a good judge of character. Another remarked that muscles really do make a person truly beautiful. And yet another added that one should practice a lot and then everything would work out. The girls who looked at this picture were disgusted. They said that it was some kind of abomination and did not understand what these people were doing, but the heroine in turn liked it very much. It turns out that there were 2 rumors among the knights. The first of them told that the lady was taken from the orphanage. The second denounced the mystery of the girl's birth and her blood connection to the Duke. The child had arrived at the mansion in very poor condition, and no one had spoken out about it, but excitement was in the air. Meles was now really very happy that the little one was healthy and smiling so good-naturedly. Except that my lady's look at these men now was far from simple childlike innocence. Somehow she had the feeling that no other 7-year-old girl in the world would feel such delight at the sight of muscles. At the same time, His Majesty the Duke looked at her and was surprised. He turned to his subordinates and inquired about their children's reactions to something like this as well. They immediately looked at each other, not understanding what the man was talking about. One of them asked what His Majesty meant by such a thing. My lord remarked that his daughter was simply his daughter, and crazy about muscles. The interlocutor remarked to his lordship that it was normal for a child of her age to like things that adults find strange. The kids standing over there were also into oddball things when they were kids, like collecting cookie wrappers, for example. Mono noticed that his daughter was collecting rocks from the ground into a box. A man standing nearby laughed and remarked the state was even cute, but his son was carrying dead insects to his house. The knights talked about their children, and for the first time in his life, His Majesty listened passionately to their stories based on personal experience. He thought it was amazing, for he was truly able to empathize with other people's feelings. Suddenly, his interlocutor turned to him and remarked that now his lordship had also become a father. So he wondered if he would like to share his parental concerns with them. He pondered for a while and then remarked that his daughter was too clever. The interlocutors were a little shocked because of this, and His Majesty said if any of them had even used words like embezzlement at the age of 7. Also, she had already read all the fairy tales he had advised her. There were more than 50 books in Leonier's room, and can you really calculate so much literature in less than a month? If you compare with other children, the little girl is as brave as a lioness. She is constantly making conflicts and trying to fight it. But here, after her strange Igor still manages to bake cookies for him, it seems that she really has a lot of talents, and he should think about what he wants to teach her first. Also, after the little one starts to pick up on things, she gets really cute. Being Boreati, she'll have no problem getting support in social circles. But here it was unclear how many people she could impress with her looks. The interlocutors were in shock from the influx of such a large amount of information, so they did not understand how they should even respond to this. But suddenly, all their attention was drawn to themselves by the main character, who was rejoicing. The girl was screaming and begging for the knight to do like this again. They, in turn, noticed that she could not, in that case, sing for them, and he would try to match the tune. The heroine remarked that if it was necessary to sing, she would do it. Next, the girl started singing a tune about how she loves muscles, and looking at muscles is so wonderful. Looking at biceps, triceps, and pecs and abs muscles are the best wonder of wonders. Now she sang that she would consider the lower muscles, and it was about the thighs. The knights continued to show off their girl bodies to the rhythm of the music. Next, they made a wave of muscles, and the heroine was shocked by it. She immediately blushed and admired their movements. His Majesty was discouraged from this and already wanted to head towards them. But he was stopped by Mono, who touched his shoulder. He immediately noticed his lordship, as if to say, his uncles never admired muscles so much. Their mistress simply turns out to be a bit special. Also, if one were to judge, the teachings have always had a rather odd preference. The girl, for her part, continued to admire the muscles and shouted for joy. Sometime after that, heroine was already in her room and it was morning. After the girl woke up, then immediately ran to the window and scrutinized what was there. There, the little girl saw a huge pile of snow and therefore rejoiced. And suddenly, a maid entered her room, who noticed that the mistress really woke up early. The girl responded by wishing her a good morning. At the same time stated that it had snowed so much, and it was the first time she had seen such drifts. The interlocutor said that in fact, this year's snowstorms are not so strong than in previous years. The heroine was surprised and asked if this is true. She probably thinks this is the norm. But still, there are snowdrifts literally as high as a man outside, The maid, in turn, said that last year the snow reached the windows of the second floor. So it turns out that in winter in the estate of Burvoy, these all live and work on the third floor, and maybe even higher. The girl thought about the fact that the living room where they spent time with the Duke was also on the third floor. The maid turned to the girl and asked her what she would like to wear today. Next, the maid showed the girl a huge number of outfits. They were both yellow and blue dresses. So she stated that all these outfits looked really great, but the girl chose the black one and remarked how about it. His Majesty leisurely approached the room. Suddenly, he heard the girl addressing him and calling him an old man again. So he turned his attention to her and saw that the girl was running in a dark dress. She inquired if he had slept well today. The girl also asked if he had dreamed anything enchanting and if she was in his dreams. The man picked her up in his arms and remarked that he didn't think dreams involving her could be considered happy. The little girl was angry about that and said, "Is he really picking a fight again? And why is it that he doesn't ask how she spent her own night?" Her father stated that she simply looked as if nothing had disturbed her sleep. Suddenly, the heroine began to smell his body. Next, she asked if the man had returned from a workout, because his body looked wet and also smelled like soap. The man was surprised because of this. Finally, they arrived at the table where a meal was already waiting for them. The man was leaving his daughter at the table, and then stated that he had completely forgotten something. Still, they had set a date on which they would hunt monsters. The heroine inquired, but also when they would start doing it after all. His Majesty stated that it would all happen tomorrow. The daughter was surprised and asked if it was really so soon. The man stated that they were simply actually a bit late and should have even set off today. He, in turn, would leave after introducing her to the guest mentors. The girl was once again wary because of this and asked which mentors they were talking about. Sometime after this conversation, several carriages arrived at His Majesty's estate. They stopped right at the entrance of the manor, and from there, a man as well as a woman got out. At the entrance, the protagonist as well as the Duke were already waiting for them. These people immediately got out of their carriages and bowed to them. The woman noticed that her name was Karina Tedrosa, and she was the new etiquette teacher for the girl. The heroine immediately thought she was very pretty indeed. Next, a man introduced himself. He remarked that he was glad to meet her, and his name is Andrea. It turns out that he is a history teacher. The girl thought that she looked the more nerdy of the two. His Majesty looked at the thoughtful girl and immediately turned to her. After that, the heroine bowed before them and remarked that she was glad to meet him too, and, having introduced herself, declared that her name was Leonie Boriotti. The professors, then also evaluating, looked at the girl. His Majesty remarked that Countess Tedrosa would come to their estate once a week. Andrea, on the other hand, would stay here to live with them. Sometime after that, everyone went inside. While His Majesty was undressing, the girl turned to him. She asked if she needed to be more attentive to anything. The man asked her why she thought she had to worry about nothing. After all, it turns out that these are the very people who should be courteous, as well as polite to her. Now they are in the north, and here for a girl can behave in a woozy way. That is why let her not be afraid to do something wrong. The girl immediately became enthusiastic and asked if she could even kill someone or torture someone. The father thought for a moment and then said that these were extreme measures, but she could be calm and do whatever she wanted. Let her simply act like when they first met, when they had not only seen each other at the orphanage. The heroine smiled because of this and said that, as expected, people need to be born with power to be happy. Next, they headed forward together. His Majesty said that the girl should be grateful to him for all of this. The heroine was annoyed about this and remarked that it must be pretty hard for him to live with the kind of character he has after all. But here it was anyway. She would like to know what kind of people they were before she started. Her father glanced at her and then remarked that Andrea was a rather talented person. He was a professor at the Imperial Academy. The Imperial Academy is a scientific research institute that only the most outstanding people in the Empire can enter. Because of its great influence, this educational institution is considered the third pillar of power. Most of the students who have graduated from the academy live and work afterwards in the capital. He, in turn, was also a graduate of this academy. The heroine immediately thought about what this grandfather was guilty of, that he was dragged as far as the north of the court. Next, The girl asked if there was a similarly powerful man in these parts. Her interlocutor answered her nothing and just looked at her coldly. Next, the girl inquired, "But what about the Countess of Tedros?" The father first smiled and then sat down beside the girl and gave her a candy. Next, he stroked the girl's head and noticed that this particular one had haunted him before. The protagonist immediately became wary and then shouted why the old man had called such a lady to her. She noticed that this old woman was really very strange and did not understand what was going on here at all. At the same time, she was already imagining how the two of them would abuse the girl. His Majesty noticed that no one in the north knows noble etiquette better than her. To top it all off, this woman is quite famous in the social circles of the capital. He explains all this to her to make her realize that he is not a dullard or an ignoramus. The girl asked him what the peculiarity of the capital's society was. Father said that it certainly does not differ much from the noble meetings here, because it is just as dirty. At first glance, the nobles organize social rounds for socializing. But in reality, it is a battlefield of greed, conspiracies, and meticulously planned machinations. And if the academy is the third force of the empire, the noble society is the second force. The man noticed that girls would have to participate in such activities sooner or later. It was because it was simply inevitable for a member of the Boreati family. Frankly speaking, he himself does not want to send her away from there. And just after that, the girl immediately stopped. His Majesty saw this and tried to lift her into his arms because he thought she wanted to. Many heroines shook her head, saying that it is not that. Next, she reached out her hand and noticed, this is what she wanted. The interlocutor immediately pulled a candy bar out of his pocket and held it out to the girl. She squeaked out that this was not what she meant at all. Immediately afterward, she took the man's hand, but it turned out that she took it by the fingers, for the hand was huge. It was quite tender, and the little girl noticed him holding her hand. His Majesty was disconsolate, and from this, his face betrayed the emotion. The little girl looked at him and asked if he didn't want to. The father stated that it wasn't that he didn't want to, and then the girl smiled. Next, they headed off together, and the man thought it was rather slow. On the way, the girl turned to him and noticed that that old woman was actually quite suspicious. But even so, she would simply study hard, so let him come back soon. Her father saw the girl's worried face, and so suggested that she go after he returned from hunting at the orphanage. The little girl agreed to this. The man further stated that while he was gone, let her not dare to cry because she missed him. The little girl was quite somber and remarked that she was not going to cry. His Majesty saw this and smiled. Next, he asked the girl if she thought she would be homesick. She stated that she would probably be a little. The interlocutor noticed that even now she did not want to answer him honestly, and the heroine stated that she went into it after all. Sometime afterward, the day of departure for the hunt had already come after all. His Majesty the Duke was already in full uniform and prepared to go. The girl in her turn was near him and was yawning very much at that moment, for she wanted to sleep. The man asked, but why she does not go to sleep from yawning her mouth is now just torn. Then he took the girl in his arms, and she noticed that she was very cold. At that, she stated that he was leaving after all, so she couldn't help but walk him out. The father looked at her then, and he thought it was cute. After that, he remarked that the girl should go and sleep some more, because she should not force herself to wake up so early as today. The girl, in turn, turned her attention to the maid who was standing nearby. Then she motioned for the man to let her go downstairs, and pointing with her hand to the maid, who was holding a basket, the girl remarked that she wanted to present this to him. His Majesty at once looked forward and was dumbfounded at what he saw there. There was a basket full of sweets in the form of cookies. He started looking at all these cookies and wondered with amazement when she had time to bake all these. The girl kept yawning and noticed that she did sneak into the kitchen at night. The heroine said that she was his daughter after all. At that, she remembered a conversation she had with Rupa. She asked him if the old man liked her baked goods. He said that of course he liked it, because he didn't even let him taste it and ate it all himself. Apparently because of this, he really liked it. It was because of this that the girl had purposely put a lot of goodies for him. The envelopes with the lion painted on them were for His Majesty, and they had more cookies in them. The girl was now in the arms of the maid and was falling asleep. She wished her father a safe journey. She also asked for something delicious for herself when he returned. After saying that, she fell asleep immediately. His Majesty was shocked by this, and he was very pleased that the girl had done all this. Immediately after that, he walked closer to her and stroked her head. As he did so, he thought that there was nothing in the world more appetizing than this, and if there was such a delicacy, he would simply destroy it. Then he told the girl that during his absence, she would be the head of the Boreati family. The man then turned to his subordinates and told them to take good care of the girl. The subordinates immediately bowed to him and saying that they would do their best. The man leaned over to her and asked Leonie that she study well. Also, have her go to bed early and eat plenty of food while doing so. The girl through the sun agreed to all this. Next, His Majesty remarked that also she should not show her love for muscles all the time, but suddenly heard that the heroine began to snore. The interlocutor was angry because of this and asked if she had fallen asleep on purpose just now. After that, the Duke turned to the knight Sir Caber. To him, he remarked to the man to protect the girl. The subordinate at once praised his weapon and earnestly declared that he would always be by his mistress's side. But after that, to His Majesty looked at the heroine and thought that this little girl so and attracts his attention to himself. Because of that, he even somehow doesn't want to leave. But despite this, he had no election, so he headed straight for the exit and led the hunter after him. The first time the girl woke up early in the morning to see off the old man as well as the knights. But lo and behold, when she opened her eyes the second time, the sun was already in zenith. The girl got up, changed her clothes, and then also had lunch. After that, the girl walked down the corridors of the manor and turned to her protector. She asked him if it was true that Miss Mellis was involved in the hunt. The interlocutor stated that it was, so he would guard her until the Duke himself returned. The girl then also inquired, but when they would return. The man stated that it was likely that the company would indeed take a little longer this time. While his lordship had been in the capital for 3 years, the knights of Glasdigo had to hunt on their own. They, in turn, had certainly reduced the monster population, but that was nothing compared to their master's accomplishments. In addition to all this, the monster's numbers and increased many times over after the mating season. Immediately after he said that, it stopped and realized that he had said something unnecessary. And the girl turned to him and asked if it was the mating season. The interlocutor immediately began to justify himself and noticed that he meant love. Because of the fact that they love each other, there are more and more of them. The heroine remarked that fish shoes are so beautiful. Caber, in turn, remarked that it was really so felt the truth high as well as magnificent. But suddenly, the girl inquired about what does happen after falling in love passes. The interlocutor was horrified because of this and did not know what to answer this question. Suddenly, the heroine turned her attention forward, and there she saw her tax, a history teacher. He, in turn, also turned his head toward the girl and looked at her. After a moment, the girl saw that the man had disappeared into one of the rooms near where he was. But that made her even more curious, so she immediately ran over there. Then she looked inside to see what was there. The girl asked if the teacher was tired after all, and asked if he was comfortable here. The man said that such large mansions usually have everything they need for life, so he should not have any problems. He added that he was from the north himself. Immediately after that, he smiled at the lady and handed her a book. At the same time, he asked if she wanted to start the lesson right away. And so, after a while, they did have that very lesson. Soon, the girl was on her way to the Countess's etiquette lesson. The first thing the woman noticed was that they would learn the rules for greetings. It might be difficult in the beginning, of course, but she would do her best to help her. Let the girl not be shy after all, and ask the forester. Something will be unclear to her. The heroine agreed to this. After that, the teacher told her what to do first of all when she said hello. And so the girl already practiced bowing before the interlocutor. The teacher stated with a smile on her face that she was really good at it. She could not imagine that the girl would master everything so quickly. The heroine smiled at her because of this and thought that it was nothing after all. The Countess went on to say that she was truly amazing, and frankly, something had been bothering her before that. Suddenly she stopped and remarked that her tongue is her enemy after all, so she apologizes to the young milady. The protagonist, in turn, simply smiled at that moment. And the interlocutor said that the lady is really very similar to the Duke. Probably, that's why it seems so mature and graceful. However, she still needs to get rid of some of her flaws. She may still have a hard time because of her old habits, but there is nothing she can do about it anymore. The heroine kept smiling and thought that maybe it was because this world is inside a novel, but the people here are quite inventive in finding new ways to kill themselves. One afternoon, the girl was sitting with her history teacher. They were eating, and the girl asked him what kind of person the Countess of Tedrosa was. The man was surprised by this question a little and thought about it. The girl understood that her father had found 2 teachers for her, but there were some problems. The first of them has a lack of professionalism, and the second has uncontrolled criticism. The man told the girl that he had heard she had already been taught to read, so he asked her to try to study the book on her own. If anything becomes unclear to her, let him simply call her out on it. And the teacher kept saying that the girl her straight knew nothing, so she would be happy to teach the lady everything. The girl was a little angry at her father and thought that he certainly gives leave his only daughter with suspicious personalities. Hey, so much of it is all delusional that it's even a little funny. But even so, at least Mr. Ardea is true to his calling. He patiently answered all her questions on the subject, and another grandfather tried to find words understandable for children. All the while, this man changed the approach to her learning altogether. Now they were discussing all the topics they were going over and even got a little ahead of themselves. The teacher was really sincerely interested in her opinion. He clearly stopped hacking and began to take their lessons really seriously. Sometimes they could just chat while eating desserts just like today. The man stated as far as the Countess was concerned, he seemed to recall something. If he wasn't mistaken, her maiden name was Karina Marioka. The Countess Marioka belongs to a noble and rather ancient family. Their residence is in the capital, so they have no influence in the north. The Boreati, on the other hand, are the protectors of the north, so they have actual power here. If you think about it, among the aristocrats of the north, almost all of their families are related to the Boreati. Some representatives even have the fangs of the beast. The girl immediately thought, really, for example, like Regina. And so it turns out that women like Lady Karina in high society say that she is like some kind of poisonous snake. She charms with speeches and clouds the mind of man, and in her compliments and praises always traced mockery and contempt. Everyone knows, of course, that heart wounds take the longest to heal. The interlocutor looked at the girl and asked if she was talking to her like that too. The heroine thought for a second, and then noticed that she talks to her like that all the time. Only now she remembered their first lesson. Then the woman noticed that my lady was so beautiful and talented, right in line with the Duke. That was a good reason to work harder on her flaws after all. The girl realized that the lady kept mentioning that she was of low origin. In the second lesson, the heroine realized that this woman kept staring at her sneakily. In that lesson, she noticed that if the girl wanted to pay for the tibial kindness, she would have to try even harder. It turns out that doesn't he piss the girl off by mentioning that she was very lucky to be the Duke's adopted daughter. On the 3rd week of training, the woman noticed that it was so difficult for her to give up her old habits. It turns out their last meeting, despite the girl's best efforts, she continued to act arrogant because of her questionable background. At such moments, their heroine could barely contain herself and thought that whether this Kikimora thinks that she is smarter than everyone. After all, as the heroine could imagine that this woman clearly lacks common sense, and the girl told the interlocutor that the teacher does not understand that this is only childish babble. The man continued to smile with her. And then the heroine took a fork and poked Andrea's dessert. In doing so, the blow was so strong that the man, shook. The girl then noticed that Lady Tedrosa apparently decided to go to the dust. With a rather frantic look, she inquired if she should help her to do so. Next, she began to gobble up the man's dessert, and remarked that she would detail the whole hurts in her hands that turn away. The teacher who was nearby was horrified by this. He thought that from the look of this girl is just a child, but inside some devil. There is something creepy and sinister about her, like Phaleo would have. She's like a predator lurking in ambush, waiting for the moment to sink its fangs into the throat of its prey. The man thought that Thadros's similar lineage was indeed doomed, for the girl had literally just executed his pudding. Late in the afternoon, A maid was putting the protagonist to bed. She inquired if the girl was comfortable like that. The little girl remarked that she was fine that way. Next, the interlocutor said that if there was anything she still needed, let her ring the bell, and then she would hear. Next, the heroine wished Connie good night. The maid was also leaving her room and wished my lady pleasant dreams. But the girl, in turn, did not fall asleep at that moment, but was awake. Immediately after the girl left her room, the heroine reached for the box in which there were sweets. She poured them out on the bed and immediately began to count them from 1 to the end. That's when the girl counted the candies that gave her a duke for good behavior. Then she realized that she was here much longer than it seemed to her before. Also, the heroine thought about the fact that the knights are delayed from their hunt after all. It so happens that one day the girl woke up in the body of a little girl who was in the orphanage. But despite this, she was lucky enough to meet the protagonist of the novel and become his adopted daughter. As a result, it turns out that she became a noble lady now. But still, she does not believe in all this, because it is more like a dream. The girl missed his lordship quite a lot and hoped that he would come back soon. Because of this whole situation, she was quite sad. Therefore, she pondered for a while and then jumped on the bed. At the same time, she realized that if she thought carefully, another etiquette lesson would happen to her tomorrow. At the same time in the night, His Majesty the Duke was walking through the forest. When he reached a certain point, you saw a monster in front of him that growled at him. The monsters heard some person approaching him and immediately turned his attention to him. And immediately after he saw him, he rushed towards the Duke. The man saw that this monster was preparing an attack on him, and so he immediately jumped away from him. Therefore, the blow the monster wanted to give him was not successful. Because of this, the beast started screaming even more frantically. Immediately after that, His Majesty grabbed his sword and jumped up. He was already preparing to attack in order to strike, the target being opposite him. And just a moment later, his ball did head towards the victim. As a result of this swift attack, the monster was defeated. The man stepped back not far from him and only brushed off his ball with the remnants of blood that were left by this monster. Immediately afterward, he turned to the knight named Ceres. From him, he inquired if they had already discovered the cubs of this monster. The knight said that they had not found any, and apparently the monster was alone. It turns out that for the past 3 years, the knights had been doing well without the help of the Duke. Still, this one is pretty suspicious considering it's mating season. Bifer monsters, when the breeding season comes, prefer to live in mountain caves. There they wait until the following spring, hunting mice and other small critters, but they are usually aggressive. To the man's memory, these creatures have never been so hostile, and even more so when the whole of the cubs are present. Next, His Majesty turned to his troop and remarked that we should get out of here. When the troop heard this, the Tony immediately rejoiced and thought that this was good fortune after all. After a while, the Duke turned to Labive. The girl approached him and inquired what his lordship needed from her. The interlocutor inquired if she happened to know where desserts intended for children could be found. The girl smiled because of this and stated that she could not vouch that the lady would like it, but there was a bakery where her brother liked to go. His Majesty asked, but also what he buys there. The knight stated that it was now about cloud profiteroles. The protagonist, in turn, the next day was at the etiquette lesson. She was walking along a path and had a book on her head to keep her posture as straight as possible. The teacher was smiling brightly and praising the girl for doing it magically. Next, the woman remarked that they would probably end the lesson for today. The heroine bowed to her after that and said goodbye. And so when she did, the teacher again looked down at her as if you were looking down on her with a look of disapproval. The girl perfectly saw all this and just smiled back. She was perfectly aware that this woman was doing it again. The heroine had noticed her contemptuous looks a long time ago after all. He's dipped that way every time she bowed. But it's time to put an end to this and everything in the smallest detail about commandeers the old man when he returns. Next, the woman walked over to the girl and patted her on the shoulder. At the same time declared that she should never forget that her every misstep might affect the Duke. When the girl heard this, she immediately thought how this woman was not tired of repeating such nonsense over and over again. At the same time, she thought that this person should be prepared, because her father will not let her get away with it so easily. She is a black lioness and also his darling daughter. Whether she is adopted or born does not matter at all. Now the girl remembered the words of her other teacher, that the most difficult thing is to heal a wounded heart. All these thoughts tormented her head, so the heroine wondered if her words had hurt the girl. "Further, teacher," said my lady, "that she really grasped everything on the fly, and it is very commendable." The heroine immediately afterwards thanked the countess, and the interlocutress went on to say that after all, one should not forget about one's origin. The little girl was wary and asked with surprise about the words about her origin. Rafinha nodded and said that the girl should honor the duke who had allowed her to live in luxury. After all, it was thanks to him that she would inherit all the wealth of the family. If it were not for this man, they would not have had the opportunity to get to know her. So it will be, the girl will do well not to give his lordship any trouble. The girl, with a burst afterward, addressed Countess Tedrosa. She stated that she had always listened to her words and would remember her every word. The interlocutor, with a smile on her face, remarked that she was very flattered, and the heroine went on to say in such a way that she let her now listen to her, so that her foot would not be here anymore. Ever since the countess had seen it, she had been disgusted by it. By saying this, she meant the main character she had seen. Simplicity is a terrible power, especially if one knows how to use it. It certainly sounds rather self-righteous, but it is thanks to a handsome, excellent student that a woman can get anything she wants, and that even includes His Majesty the Duke. What she wants to do is to make this gorgeous man belong only to her. At first, the woman thought that one smile would be enough, and then he will desire you for her. But in the end, she was simply rejected by him. His Majesty was cold and also indifferent towards her. The woman had to marry another man who was from a noble family, and everything was wonderful. But all this was happening until a strange rumor reached them. One day, her interlocutor remarked to her that some girl had appeared to His Majesty the Duke. She then immediately thought, is it an illegitimate child? How could this happen after all? In the capital, Filio had an impeccable reputation. There were rumors that before with someone he signed a contract, which preempted all the risks associated with children. But now it was unclear to the woman where this bastard had come from. So at night she thought that she should check everything personally, because you cannot believe what all these gossipers say. If she is rebuked, at the same time for jealousy will not be negative, because she is really jealous of this man. She is jealous of the woman who bore this man a child, and she is jealous of the allowance that Filio is close to, and also of the very child that so suddenly appeared and became the center of attention for him. But at least her knees cowered as she bowed to the woman. The countess enjoyed the process and thought that like this, let him continue to bow to her, because she should know her place, and she only wanted this girl to obey her. And so the heroine noticed that she had always listened to her and would remember her every word. So now let the woman listen to her, and she wanted her foot to be here no more. The interlocutor at once agreed to this with a smile, but then she came to her senses and realized the essence of these words she had just heard. The protagonist, with a smile on her face, remarked that a person who does not know what can be said and what is not, no place in the house Boreati. Immediately after that, the heroine turned around valiantly and remarked that she certainly did not intend to force her out. So let her go now, before she lost her dignity. The woman was dumbfounded for a while and continued to kneel in the room by which the girl had left her. After a few moments, she came to her senses and then rose and began to run. And now the countess ran sharply out of the room and asked the heroine to stop. But the girl was already far away and was with her own maid as well as her own protector. Also, when she came out, she noticed the looks of the maids as well as the servants, who were only looking at her. This made her quite uncomfortable, for she realized that she was being treated strangely. Then the woman slowly began to descend the stairs and headed straight towards the protagonist. The knight took up his weapon and remarked to Countess Tedrosa not to take a step further. We immediately angrily moose and noticed that simply she and the lady had some misunderstanding. The girl inquired about some other misunderstanding. The interlocutor remarked that perhaps she had done something accidentally. The heroine interrupted her again and asked how it was accidental. The woman continued to say something, but the heroine kept interrupting her. She asked if she was really saying that she was unintentionally doing all this. The girl got very angry at that moment and used her power. The knight was startled to notice this and realized that it was now the fangs of a beast in front of him. At that, he thought that if she was that angry, something irreparable might happen now. Next, he turned to Miss Connie and asked that she take care of herself. At the same time, the maid was already on her knees and could not move. Her body was trembling very much, and she was breathing very heavily, for she was completely short of air at that moment. Evil energy continued to emit from the protagonist, and she was at the same time slowly walking towards her abuser. The Countess was already on her knees and was also breathing very hard because she was short of air. The girl came closer to the woman, and the Countess looked her straight in the eyes. The heroine asked if she had forgotten what she had literally recently told her. After all, it turns out that literally every word her teacher said to her, she will always remain in her heart. The knight who was protecting the girl was also having a hard time at this time, and he was literally on his knees. But still, he could at least move. At the same time, he looked at my lady and thought that she had made a mistake after all when she ignored his words. The man recalls that before all this happened, he didn't stand around waiting for the girl to finish her lesson. Then the little girl came out and they immediately inquired if her class was already over. But literally immediately they felt the evil aura that emanated from her, so they immediately tensed up and looked at the girl. She, in turn, was very angry at that moment and had already used her beast fangs, and further remarked to them that Countess Tedrosa was not her teacher from now on. The knight wondered what could have happened between them. And after all, if Lady Leonie lost her temper again, she would leave very badly, and that could not be allowed to happen. So he approached the girl and remarked that he understood everything, and further inquired whether he should carry her. The heroine, in turn, remarked that she wanted to go for a walk. The maid immediately ran to the side and remarked that then she would bring the outer garment now. The man took the girl in his arms and inquired what was bothering her. The power that emanated from her gradually began to subside. The girl did not answer him anything, and he still thought that everything was all right. Now the knight was well aware that the beast's fang had clearly been awakened by the provocation, but it was over as soon as the emotions subsided. If then they had made it to the walk in time, everything could have turned out really differently. But now the protagonist stood before her abuser and told her that on the first day, she had told her that she was repulsive, for she had been born of a casual liaison. Then she said that she should be grateful to the Duke for his favor. Also to all this, she said that the girl could not get rid of her habits because of her own origin. So she now asked her interlocutor not to pretend to be a sheep because she could see through her dirty soul. The woman was horrified at what was happening, but could do nothing. And the girl asked what she had decided to say with her poisonous tongue this time. Trying to squeeze out a word, the Countess tried to say that she did not mean it, but the fangs were coming closer and closer to her. The girl noticed that her interlocutor was saying that it was a misunderstanding. Wasn't she the one, after all, who had insinuated that the girl should know her place, and also was not to become a nuisance to the Duke? But what, then, could that mean? The room they were in immediately began to be covered in frost from the power that came from the protagonist. Also, the woman's hand was already bloody due to the force touching it. The girl noticed that she had actually figured out her nefarious plans from the very beginning. But today she couldn't keep silent anymore, so unable to understand where she thought the girl belonged in this house. Does she think she is a naive girl and a pathetic orphan? The body of the main character's victim gradually began to crack. The knight noticed all this one and realized that they were about to have a problem. If you take into account that the girl is still a child, then this constitutes an even more serious threat. Within her lies immense power, but she has no idea how to control that power. The ice fangs, in turn, began to get closer and closer to the victim, and because of this, the Countess's body began to tremble. But also, the ice fangs were all over the room, and so the maids were also in danger. The knight realized that he couldn't move, but he still needed to stop her somehow. If he didn't, then things would be very bad indeed. But lo and behold, there was only one person who could resist such a monstrous power. He thought, if only the Duke was around, things would be much easier. Suddenly, the door swung open and His Majesty the Duke walked in. He looked inside carefully and asked what was going on here. Also stated that he had been told the girl was furious, but not lied to. He further stated that his daughter had never been taught good manners after all,